There is a particular kind of silence that has nothing to do with the absence of sound. Anyone who has spent time in a rural place, really spent time there, sleeping with windows open, waking before the birds, understands what I mean. True silence is never really quiet. There are crickets. There are frogs cycling through their endless negotiations with the dark. There is the ambient hiss of wind through tall grass, the distant complaint of a car moving somewhere on a road you cannot see. There is always something. Even at 3 a.m. in the middle of nowhere, the world is never fully still. That is how you know when something is wrong. Not by the presence of a strange sound, but by the total, impossible erasure of all the sounds that are supposed to be there. Caleb Mercer was 51 years old in the autumn of 2018. He had lived his entire life within a 12-mile radius of the land his grandfather had first cleared and planted in the 1930s. He had watched his father age and fade in the same farmhouse where he had been born, had inherited not just the acreage and the equipment and the debt, but the particular way of moving through the world that comes from generations of people who have worked the same ground. He was not a mystical man. He was not interested in ghost stories or conspiracy theories or the kinds of things that people discuss in online forums late at night. He drank his coffee black. He kept his accounts in a paper ledger. He went to bed early and rose before the sun and measured the success of a day by the concrete, tangible progress of work completed. The orchard sat on a broad, gentle slope east of the Wenatchee River in central Washington state, in a valley that the Cascade Range cups on 3 sides like a hand sheltering a flame. The Columbia Basin stretches out to the east, high desert country, and the transition between those two landscapes, the wet, forested mountains to the west and the dry, open plains to the east, happens precisely in this valley, which is why the apple industry took root here generations ago. The combination of warm days and cold nights, the volcanic soil, the controlled irrigation, it produces some of the finest fruit in the world. And the growers who work this land have a quiet, undemonstrative pride in that fact that they would never state aloud. Caleb had walked these rows since he could walk at all. He knew each tree the way a shepherd knows each animal. He knew the ones that were slow to blossom and the ones that overproduce and strip themselves of fruit before it can ripen. He knew the topography of the land beneath the trees, where the drainage slows and where it runs fast, where the soil holds heat and where it goes cold early in the season. He knew this land the way you can only know something you have dedicated your life to. The night of September 14th, 2018, began as an ordinary night by every possible measure. The harvest season was well underway. Caleb had been on the property since before sunrise, working with the small crew he employed through the picking months. And by 9 in the evening, he was in the farmhouse, eating a late dinner alone, his boots still on, tired in the clean and honest way that comes from physical labour sustained over a long day. The television was on in the other room. He couldn't have told you what was playing. It was just noise and light in the background, the modern equivalent of leaving a candle burning. He was planning to be in bed by 10:30. He had no reason to think that night would be different from any other. There was no premonition, no unease, no sense of something coming. He has said this many times since, to the various people who have asked him to recount the events. He felt nothing. And then the lights went out. It happened all at once, not the gradual flicker of a circuit tripping somewhere in the house, but a simultaneous extinction of every powered thing on the property. The television, the refrigerator, the outdoor security lights he kept running on a timer, the digital clock on the microwave, the router, all of it gone in the same instant. The farmhouse filled with a darkness that felt immediately total and complete. The kind of dark that takes your eyes a moment to accept because it seems at first like a condition of your vision rather than of the world outside you. Caleb sat at the table for a few seconds, waiting for the generator to kick on. He had a backup system for exactly this kind of situation. A habit inherited from his father, who had lost a refrigerator full of produce to a summer outage and never forgot it, but the generator did not start. He checked his phone. 11:42 in the evening. He had a signal barely, the way you always barely have a signal out there. He tried calling the power company's outage line and got a busy signal. He put the phone in his pocket and went to find a flashlight. He remembers pausing at the back door of the farmhouse before going outside. He remembers putting his hand on the doorknob and just standing there for a moment, though he cannot say why. There was no conscious reason for the pause. He opened the door and stepped out into the yard. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the silence of a quiet night. He knew that silence, not the reduced background noise of a rural area unpopulated by traffic. This was something else. This was the silence of a space that has been evacuated of everything that usually fills it. The crickets were gone. Not diminished, not unusually quiet, gone all at once as if something had reached into the dark and switched them off. The same way the power had been switched off. The frogs along the irrigation ditch that ran along the south edge of the property. Gone. The distant sound of trucks on the state route 2 miles east. Gone. Even the wind, which had been blowing steadily from the northwest all day, had stopped. Not faded, stopped. The air was absolutely motionless. Caleb stood in his yard in the dark with a flashlight he hadn't turned on yet, and became aware of his own breathing the way you become aware of it in a medical setting. When someone is monitoring you, and suddenly the sound of your own lungs seems loud and strange and biological. He stood there long enough for his eyes to adjust. The sky was clear, and the stars were sharp above him. The Milky Way doing its tilted sweep across the darkness, the way it does out there where there is very little light pollution. He has said that he was looking at the sky almost immediately, though he could not explain why. Some instinct drew his gaze upward, and that is when he saw it, just above the canopy of the orchard, which was to the north of the farmhouse, the rows running east-west up the slope. There was a light. He has struggled for years to describe it accurately, to resist the temptation to reach for familiar language that doesn't quite fit. It was pale, almost white, but with a quality that he sometimes describes as internal, as if it was not reflecting light from somewhere else, but generating its own illumination the way a lantern does, from within. It was not spherical. This is something he always emphasizes, aware that the cultural image of a UFO is circular, a saucer, a disc. This was rectangular, or nearly rectangular. The edges were not crisp the way the edges of a manufactured object are crisp. They were slightly blurred, slightly uncertain, the way an image appears when a lens is not quite in focus, or the way a reflection shimmers at the margins when water is disturbed. It was approximately, and he uses this word carefully, aware of the imprecision, approximately the size and shape of a large window, or perhaps a section of wall. He estimates it was hovering perhaps 30 feet above the top of the tallest apple trees, which would put it perhaps 50 or 60 feet above the ground. It made no sound. In that absolute silence, it hung there, emitting its pale, uncertain light, and Caleb Mercer stood in his yard and looked at it with a particular frozen quality of a person whose brain has received information it does not yet have a category for. He counted the seconds. He has said this many times, that some automatic part of him began counting the moment He registered what he was seeing, as if he already knew that the duration was going to matter, was going to be something people would ask him about. He counted to 47, and then the light bent. That is the only word he has ever found for it. It did not move in the sense of travelling from one point to another along a visible path. It did not accelerate or streak. It bent, the same way a beam of light bends when it passes through a prism, but in reverse, as if the light itself was folding upward, curving into a dimension adjacent to the one Caleb was standing in. And then it was gone. Not gone in the sense of being switched off, but gone in the sense of being elsewhere, of having departed through some exit that did not correspond to any direction Caleb could name. And in the same instant, not a second after, not in the gradual way that systems restarted, the power came back on. Every light, every appliance, the refrigerator hummed, the television resumed whatever it had been showing. The generator, which had never engaged, sat silent and unnecessary in its shed. And then, as if cued by the return of electricity, the crickets resumed. All at once, not building back gradually the way they do after a car passes and startles them into silence. All at once, at full volume, as if they had simply been waiting for a signal. Caleb stood in the yard for several more minutes. He turned on his flashlight and walked to the edge of the orchard and shone it up into the trees, but there was nothing to see. He went back inside and sat at the kitchen table and sat there for a while. He did not sleep well that night. In the morning he went into the orchard at first light. The anomaly was in the northernmost section of the orchard, in the block of trees his grandfather had planted first. The oldest trees on the property, their trunks thick and gnarled and grey. In the middle of this block there was a circle. He estimated its diameter at 30 feet, though he would later measure it more carefully and find it was slightly larger than that, closer to 32 feet across. Within this circle, every apple on every tree had fallen. Not some of them, all of them. They lay on the ground in an undisturbed carpet, and what struck Caleb immediately was that they were not damaged in the way that fruit is damaged when it falls naturally. When an apple falls from a tree, it bruises on impact. The skin breaks on one side, the flesh beneath darkens and begins to soften within hours. These apples looked as if they had been gently placed on the ground. Their skins were intact, their colour was correct. They looked, he said, like a still life, like something arranged by a careful hand. The leaves within the circle were wrong, not burned, not scorched in the obvious way you might expect if something hot had passed over them. They were desiccated, the word he uses, though it took him a few days to land on the right term. Dried out, the way a leaf looks in late October when the season is fully done, when the tree has called back all the chlorophyll and the tissue has given up its moisture. But this was September. The trees outside the circle were still fully green and laden with fruit. The trees inside the circle had leaves that crumbled when he touched them, that released a fine dry powder when he ran his hand along a branch. The bark of the trees inside the circle was unchanged. The root systems, as far as he could tell, were unchanged. Only the leaves and the fruit had been affected, and only within the precise boundary of the circle. He got a thermometer from the house, the kind you push into soil to check temperature for planting, and took readings inside the circle and outside it. The ground outside the circle, in full morning shadow, read at about 58 degrees. The ground at the centre of the circle read at 69 degrees, 11 degrees warmer in the middle of the night, under a sky that had been clear and cold. He took multiple readings to be sure. The heat was real and consistent. His neighbour to the east, a man named Dougherty, who worked in construction, had a Geiger counter he he used when his crew did demolition work in older buildings where asbestos and other materials sometimes turned up unexpectedly. Caleb asked to borrow it that morning, giving some vague explanation about wanting to check something, and spent an hour moving through the orchard with it. Outside the affected circle, the readings were what he expected: background radiation, the normal ambient count that exists everywhere on Earth. Inside the circle, particularly at the centre, the counter clicked at a rate noticeably above baseline. Not dramatically so. He was not looking at a contaminated site, not at levels that would register as dangerous, but distinctly, measurably elevated in a way that should not have been possible on an apple farm in central Washington. He took photographs of everything. He took photographs of the fallen fruit and the desiccated leaves and the ring where the affected area met the normal area. The boundary was remarkably clean, he noted, more like a line drawn with a compass than the ragged edge you'd expect from any natural process. He took photographs of the soil readings on his thermometer. He photographed the trees inside the circle from multiple angles. He did not know quite what he was documenting or why, only that some instinct told him to document it, that whatever had happened here was not going to be easy to explain, and that evidence, visible and tangible evidence, was going to matter. He called nobody that day. He went back and forth about calling the county extension office, which handles agricultural anomalies and disease outbreaks and that kind of thing, but he hesitated. He was not sure how to describe what he'd seen the night before, without sounding like someone whose account should not be taken seriously. He was a third-generation farmer with a reputation in the valley. He had relationships with suppliers and distributors that depended on being perceived as a stable and rational person. He did not want to be the man who called the county extension office and said there had been lights above his orchard, and now there was a circle in his trees, so he waited. That same morning, on the other side of the ridge that separated his property from the Halloran dairy farm, 3 cows had spent the night standing motionless in the paddock nearest Caleb's orchard. Tom Halloran, who was 63 and had been milking since he was a teenager, said he had never seen anything like it. Not cows standing still, which was unremarkable, but the particular quality of their stillness, the angle of their bodies, all 3 facing in the same direction, facing the ridge, their eyes open and fixed, not moving for the entirety of the night, as far as Tom could tell from the motion-sensitive cameras he kept in the paddock. They were normal in the morning. They ate normally and gave normal milk yields. But one of the calves born the following day, in what appeared to be a completely normal birth, had an unusual membrane condition in its eyes, a translucent secondary membrane that partially occluded vision in both eyes. The attending veterinarian had no diagnosis for it. She had not seen it in cattle. She sent photographs to colleagues at the state agricultural school and received no answer that satisfied her. Toxin exposure was ruled out. The calf was otherwise healthy. The membrane condition resolved on its own within 3 weeks, and the calf grew normally. But Tom Halloran did not forget it. Caleb checked his phone that evening for the first time since the outage. The smartwatch he wore, a basic fitness tracker, nothing sophisticated, logged his movement data automatically. And when he pulled up the previous night's log, he sat with the phone in his hand for a long time before he understood what he was seeing. The movement log showed normal activity throughout the day, the accumulated steps and elevation changes of a working day in the orchard. In the evening, it showed him sitting, the reduced activity of a person at rest. And then, at 11:42 in the evening, the log simply stopped. Not as if he had gone to bed and the tracker had registered sleep. The data just ceased, as if He had ceased to exist for the purposes of the device. The next entry in the log was at 12:16 in the morning, 34 minutes of no data at all. He looked at the phone timestamp. He remembered stepping outside during the outage. He remembered seeing the light. He remembered counting to 47. He remembered going back inside and sitting at the table. In his memory, the entire experience outside lasted no more than 5 or 6 minutes, certainly not 34. He was absolutely certain of this. He is the kind of man who is rarely uncertain about time, who has spent decades waking before alarms and knowing intuitively how much day is left. He did not believe he had been outside for 34 minutes. He had no memory of the intervening time. He had no sense of time having passed. He checked the camera footage from the security system. He ran on the farmhouse and outbuildings and found that the cameras had been offline from 11:42 to 12:16 as well, consistent with the power outage. But the outage was not supposed to have lasted that long. The power had come back on the instant the light vanished, and he was certain the light had lasted less than a minute. He has never been able to resolve this discrepancy. There is no version of the timeline he has been able to construct that makes the numbers add up. 34 minutes is missing from the record of that night in a way that cannot be explained by sensor malfunction or software error or any of the prosaic explanations he has tried to apply to it over the years. In the week that followed, Caleb's sleep was disrupted in a way that he found deeply uncomfortable to discuss, because the experience did not feel like a nightmare in the conventional sense. He was not afraid while it was happening. There was no terror, no chase, no sense of threat. What he experienced each night, on multiple occasions between sleep and full waking, was a recurring image of a corridor that had no walls. Not the absence of walls in the sense of an open space, but a corridor whose walls existed as a kind of suggestion, as a structural logic, rather than a physical boundary. He could see the shape of a passage without seeing what the passage was made of, and within this corridor, standing in arrangements that he describes as geometrically precise, were figures. Not figures that he could describe with any confidence. He could not tell you their height or their number with certainty, only that they were present, and that their arrangement in space relative to each other was exact in a way that felt mathematical. And there was a tone, not a sound exactly, or not only a sound, a vibration that he felt in his chest, in his sternum and his ribs, the way you feel the bass from a speaker that is tuned very low. He would wake from these episodes with a nosebleed on 3 separate occasions. He woke each time with a metallic taste in his mouth, the taste of old coins or a bitten lip, and on the 4th morning, when he was washing his face, he found a rash behind his left ear. 3 small marks arranged in a triangle, slightly raised, slightly warm to the touch. He photographed it. The rash faded within a week and did not return. He went to see his doctor about the nosebleeds and the metallic taste. He did not mention the lights or the orchard. He told the doctor he had been under stress and was sleeping poorly. His doctor ordered some blood work. The results came back, and his doctor called him to discuss them. 2 findings were anomalous. His iron levels were elevated significantly above his normal baseline. His doctor had his records going back 15 years, and this was a notable change, unexplained by any dietary shift Caleb could identify. And there were protein markers in his blood that his doctor had not seen before, that did not correspond to any known pathogen or autoimmune marker. His doctor suggested the lab might have made an error, which happens, and recommended they redraw the sample. The 2nd sample was lost in transit to the lab. By the time the 3rd sample was taken and analysed, several weeks later, the anomalous markers were gone. The local Facebook group for the Wenatchee Valley area a community group with a few thousand members, mostly farmers and tradespeople, and people who had grown up in the area, had been quietly accumulating posts about the night of September 14th. Caleb found them by accident, searching for information about the power outage, which he had assumed would have generated some official notice from the power company. He found the notice. The power company had attributed the outage to a transformer issue on a rural feeder line, but he also found a thread of comments underneath someone's post about the outage that had grown to nearly 80 replies. People had seen lights, multiple people, independently, without coordination. A woman in her car on the highway east of town who had pulled over when her engine began stalling. A couple who had been sitting on their porch 2 miles to the north and had watched something they described as a bright rectangle moving very slowly, and then not moving, and then being gone. A retired man who did amateur radio work from a workshop behind his house and had noticed his compass spinning erratically for several minutes during the outage window. A retired electrical engineer who lived on the north end of the valley had not seen any lights, but had been awake because of the outage. He used medical equipment that required power and had been monitoring his backup battery system. He had logging equipment running as part of his home setup, and when he reviewed the logs the following morning, he found something he posted about at length and with some technical specificity. During the period of the outage, his equipment had registered an electromagnetic surge, a sudden massive increase in electromagnetic field strength, followed by an equally sudden cessation. He described it in his post as consistent with what you would expect from the operation of an extremely powerful electromagnet, or from what he called, with obvious care for his credibility, a high-energy field compression event. He noted that the characteristics were unlike anything he had seen in 40 years of professional experience with electrical systems. He noted that the field seemed to be moving, that its signature changed in a way that suggested a source that was not stationary. He posted his data. Several people commented skeptically. He did not respond to the skeptics. He posted the data and stepped away from the conversation. The county sheriff's office sent a deputy out to Caleb's property 4 days after the incident, following a complaint from a neighbour, not about lights or anomalies, but about the circle of damaged trees, which was visible from the road and had prompted a call to the county extension office from someone who was worried about a new fungal blight. The deputy was a practical man named Vasquez, who had been in law enforcement for 22 years and was not interested in conspiracy theories. He looked at the circle. He looked at the soil temperature readings Caleb showed him. He listened while Caleb, choosing his words carefully, described what he had seen on the night of the 14th. Deputy Vasquez wrote down some notes. He took photographs of the affected area. He said the county would look into it. He attributed the power outage to the transformer issue the power company had cited. He suggested the circle might be the result of soil contamination, some old buried material that was off-gassing, which can happen in areas with agricultural history. He was not unkind. He was simply a man doing his job in the way that his job had trained him to do it. 2 days after Deputy Vasquez's visit, Caleb noticed the SUVs. There were 2 of them, parked on the ridge road that ran along the northern boundary of the property, a dirt track that accessed a cellular tower and was not typically used by anyone except the occasional hiker or a county worker doing maintenance. The SUVs were dark-coloured. He initially thought black, but later decided they might have been dark grey or dark green, and they had no identifying marks that he could see from the distance he was at, which was perhaps 300 yards. There were men with equipment near the affected circle. He walked toward them. By the time he reached the edge of his own property, they were gone. He found disturbances in the soil at the centre of the circle that were consistent with soil sampling, narrow core holes in a pattern that suggested a methodical survey. Someone had been on his land without his knowledge or permission and had taken soil samples from the precise centre of the anomaly. He did not know who they were. He was not able to find any official record of a visit from any state or federal agency. He asked Deputy Vasquez, who said he had no knowledge of any survey. He asked the county extension office. He asked the power company. Nobody claimed the visitors. The security camera system Caleb ran on the property was a consumer-grade setup, the kind you can buy at a hardware store. 8 cameras, a central recording unit, the footage stored on a hard drive inside the farmhouse. The cameras had been offline during the outage, as he had already established. But the hard drive had been running before the outage began, and when he recovered footage from the previous week, he found something that had escaped his initial review. One of the cameras, positioned on the north side of the equipment barn facing the orchard, had captured the earliest moments of the event. The footage degraded rapidly as it approached 11:42, and the image from that period was heavily corrupted, horizontal lines breaking the frame into sections, the image stuttering and doubling on itself. But there were individual frames that were cleaner than others, and Caleb spent several evenings working through the corrupted footage manually, frame by frame, trying to extract anything intelligible. What he found in the cleaner frames did not look like what he had expected. He had expected to see the pale rectangular glow he had seen with his own eyes, a solid luminous shape above the tree line. What the camera showed was different. The object, the shape, the light, whatever it was, appeared to be layered in a way that the naked eye had not conveyed, as if it had depth, or as if it was composed of multiple translucent planes stacked on top of each other, each plane slightly offset from the others, each one carrying a portion of the total luminosity. And the interior geometry of those layers was not static. In frames taken fractions of a second apart, the internal structure appeared to have shifted. Lines and angles that were present in one frame were absent in the next and replaced by different lines and angles, as if the object's interior was in constant motion, as if what you were looking at was not a solid thing, but a process, an ongoing event. He could not make any definitive claim from corrupted footage. He was aware of that. But what he saw in those frames was not consistent with any aircraft or atmospheric phenomenon he had encountered in a lifetime of living beneath these skies. And then in one frame, a single frame badly corrupted at the edges but clear enough at the centre, there was a beam, narrow, pale, descending from the underside of the layered shape into the centre of the orchard, vertical, straight. It was there for one frame and gone in the next. He does not know what to make of it. He has never known what to make of it. A ham radio operator named Gerald Fenn, who lived 40 miles to the east in the high desert country beyond the Columbia, was awake on the night of September 14th because he was almost always awake late. He was a retired school teacher with insomnia who had been a radio hobbyist for most of his adult life. He routinely logged anomalous signals, the kind of atmospheric and ionospheric events that ham operators sometimes catch by accident, and he filed his logs with a small private network of enthusiasts who shared a database. He had caught something on that night that he flagged immediately and posted about in the network the following morning. A low-frequency signal below the range of normal human hearing that had been pulsing at irregular but structured intervals. He had analysed the pulse sequence and found that the intervals between pulses corresponded to prime numbers 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13 in sequence repeating. He noted that the signal appeared to originate from the west, from the direction of the Cascades. He had, of course, no way to know that 40 miles away, in a river valley apple orchard, a man had just witnessed something strange. The two men did not connect until months later, brought together by a researcher who had found both their accounts independently. Audio enhancement software applied to the corrupted camera footage revealed a low-frequency signature in the audio track that was consistent with what Fenn had logged. The same pulse pattern, the same frequency range. Caleb had been standing in his yard during this. His chest had been vibrating. He had felt it and registered it and filed it away as part of the general strangeness of the experience, not knowing that he was standing inside a signal that someone 40 miles away was recording. The physical changes that followed in the weeks after the event were subtle enough that Caleb initially dismissed them, or tried to. He noticed, in the way you notice things when you're paying attention to yourself in a new and uncomfortable way, that his night vision had improved. Not dramatically. He was not seeing in the dark in any cinematic sense, but the adjustment time when he moved from a lit interior to a dark exterior was shorter than it had been, and he could make out details in low-light conditions that had previously been invisible to him. He noticed that sounds seemed sharper. He could hear conversations from distances that he would not previously have been able to. He noticed, and this one troubled him the most, because it was the hardest to ascribe to physiology, that he occasionally seemed to know things before they happened. Not with any dramatic specificity, not in the way a prophet knows things. Small things. He would pick up the phone 30 seconds before it rang, knowing that it would ring. He would turn toward a doorway 20 seconds before someone walked through it. He would pull his truck to the side of the road before he had consciously registered that there was something in the road ahead. These episodes happened consistently enough over a period of several weeks that he could no longer dismiss them as coincidence. They were not dramatic. They were not exciting. They were unsettling in the way that a malfunction in a reliable system is unsettling, because they represented his own perceptions behaving in ways he could not account for. His doctor, reviewing the blood work at the follow-up appointment, agreed that the anomalous protein markers were probably a lab error, given that the redrawn sample showed nothing unusual. He did not disagree with his doctor. He did not tell his doctor about the predictive episodes. He drove home and went back to work. 3 weeks after the initial incident, on the 3rd of October, the silence returned. He recognized it instantly. The same total, complete, architectural silence that had preceded the first event. He was in the farmhouse, and he became aware of it in the way you become aware of a sound stopping, because the ambient noise of the night had been present, and then it was not. And the transition was so abrupt that it registered as a physical event. He went to the window and looked toward the orchard and saw nothing. He waited. He put on his coat. He went outside. This time, there was no power loss. The farmhouse lights stayed on behind him. The security cameras, he confirmed later, ran continuously through the entire event. And the light, when it appeared closer. Not above the tree line, but above the barn, which was 40 yards closer to the farmhouse than the northern orchard block where the circle had formed. It was the same pale, internally luminous quality, the same slightly blurred edges, the same rectangular shape. But this time, Caleb was not frozen. He had had 3 weeks to process the initial experience, or to begin processing it. And when the light appeared, he stood and looked at it with a quality of attention that was deliberate rather than paralysed. He watched it for perhaps 2 minutes, and in that time, the light did something it had not done in his first sighting. It changed. Not in its external dimensions, The rectangle remained approximately the same size and shape, but in its apparent depth, it unfolded. He uses this word consistently, and with some frustration because he knows it is not adequate, but no other word has served him better. The object, the shape, the phenomenon seemed to acquire dimensions that it had not previously appeared to have. It went from looking like a flat, luminous panel to looking like a room. Not a room of any recognizable architecture, but a space with depth, a space with an interior. And through the interior, he could see something. He saw an orchard. Not his orchard, as it was in October of 2018. Not the living trees with their harvest season fullness. What he saw through the interior of the light was an orchard that appeared to be his orchard. He recognized the slope of the land, the spacing of the rows, the relative positions of the equipment barn and the farmhouse, everything oriented in the way that was as familiar to him as his own face, but abandoned. The trees were overgrown in the way that happens when an orchard is left unmanaged for many years. The canopy had spread and thickened, and where adjacent trees had once been pruned to maintain separation, they had now grown into each other, their branches interlocked into a continuous dense mass. The ground between the rows, which he kept cleared to manage pests and maintain access, was deep in unmowed grass and volunteer brush. There was no equipment visible, no sign of habitation. The farmhouse, or what he could see of the farmhouse through the limited aperture of the light, was dark and appeared to be in a state of disrepair. And the sky above this other orchard was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not the wrong colour. It was not a red sky or an alien sky in any obvious sense, but it was darker than it should have been at any time of night that corresponded to what he was experiencing. The stars, what he could see of them through the light, were arranged correctly. He was certain of that. He knew these stars, but the sky itself seemed to absorb light differently, to hold it less, as if the atmosphere above this other orchard were thinner or differently constituted. He looked at it for what felt like a long time, and then the light folded back. That same reversal of the unfolding, collapsing its apparent depth back into flatness, and bent upward and was gone. He went inside and sat at the kitchen table and did not sleep. It took him several weeks to arrive at a framework that felt adequate to what he had experienced, and even now he holds this framework loosely, aware that it is the best he has been able to do rather than a settled conclusion. He had spent those weeks reading, not in any organised or expert way, but the way a person reads when they're trying to find language for something unprecedented, pulling at whatever threads seem related, following them wherever they lead. He read about dimensional theory. He read about multiverse hypotheses in physics. He read about documented anomalies in other agricultural areas. He read about electromagnetic fields and their relationship to biological tissue. He read about the history of UAP reports, unidentified aerial phenomena, the term that had replaced the older acronym in official contexts, and was struck by how consistently the agricultural and rural cases differed from the more famous cases. The famous cases tended toward the dramatic, intercepts, military footage, air traffic anomalies. The rural cases tended toward the quiet and the strange and the biological. Circles in fields, animal behaviour changes, missing time, physical effects on plant material, the soil anomalies. He found documentation of similar events in Idaho farmland, in the high desert of eastern Oregon, in the agricultural plains of Saskatchewan. Not widely separated in time, not coincidences if you believed in the pattern. A pattern of something moving through or over agricultural land, leaving specific and consistent traces. In a corridor, that ran roughly north to south through the interior west. The object, he concluded, and he acknowledged that concluded was perhaps too strong a word, that hypothesized was more honest, was not an aircraft. It was not a craft in any sense that implied travel from one point to another through continuous space. What he had seen through the interior of the light on the night of October 3rd was a different place. Not a distant place, not a place that was far away in any navigable direction. A place that occupied the same coordinates as his orchard, but existed in a different state, a different version of the same location. The circle of fallen fruit and desiccated leaves was not damage caused by the passage of a vehicle or the discharge of an energy weapon. It was the ground-level signature of a brief partial overlap between two versions of the same place, two environments occupying the same coordinates simultaneously for a period of 47 seconds. The heat, the radiation, the electromagnetic surge. These were the friction of that overlap, the evidence of two realities pressing against each other in the same space. He is not a physicist. He does not claim any technical authority for this interpretation, but it is the interpretation that accounts for the most evidence while requiring the fewest unsupported assumptions, and he has held it for several years now without finding anything that directly contradicts it. The SUVs came back in early November. This time, one of the men approached him directly. He was standing in the orchard near the circle. The radiation had faded by this point. The thermometer was reading normal temperatures. The circle was still visible only because the desiccated leaves had not recovered and the trees within it had not re-leafed. When a man came across his property without announcing himself and introduced himself only as Mr. Hale. Mr. Hale was perhaps 50, perhaps older, with the manner of someone who has spent a long time being careful about what he reveals. He did not offer a card. He did not show identification. He asked in a conversational way that was clearly not casual whether Caleb remembered the events of September 14th clearly. Caleb said he did. Mr. Hale asked whether he had seen through it, whether he had seen what was on the other side. Caleb, who by this point had decided that honesty, in the absence of other information, was probably the safest strategy, said yes. Mr. Hale nodded, as if this confirmed something. He said that this part of the country had a history, that it wasn't the first event in the region, and probably wouldn't be the last. He mentioned, with the careful specificity of someone who has rehearsed what they are willing to say, that similar events had been documented in agricultural land in Idaho and in the eastern Oregon desert and in the Canadian plains north of the border. He implied, and this is Caleb's interpretation, he acknowledges he may have read this in, that these events were being monitored, that the monitoring had been going on for some time, and that the agency or organisation doing the monitoring was not the one whose name was on any building Caleb would recognise. Then Mr. Hale asked whether Caleb intended to be on the property on the next new moon. Caleb asked why. Mr. Hale said that based on the interval pattern in the documented events from the region, an additional event at this location was probable within the next 30 days. He said this with the tone of a meteorologist discussing an 80% chance of rain. And then he left, walking back across the property to the Ridge Road, and the SUVs drove away, and Caleb never saw Mr. Hale again. The next new moon fell on a Thursday in mid-November. Caleb was in the orchard. The silence came at 11 in the evening. He was ready for it, or as ready as you can be for something like this. He had a camera, he had a voice recorder, he had a notebook and a pen. He had a chair, because the previous events had involved standing, and he had decided that if there was going to be another one, he was going to face it seated, which felt, in some way he could not fully explain, like a deliberate choice. rather than a reactive one. He sat in the chair at the edge of the affected area and waited. The light appeared at 11:22. It appeared directly above the circle, not above the tree line as it had the first time, not above the barn as it had the second time, but directly over the ground at the centre of the circle, lower than he had seen it before. He estimated it was perhaps 20 feet above his head, close enough that he could feel something, not heat, not the warmth he would have expected from an object that had left the ground 11 degrees warmer. Something more like pressure, like the air was being asked to do something it was not designed to do. He had decided during the weeks of thinking and reading and sitting with everything that he was going to walk into the circle if the opportunity presented itself. He cannot fully explain this decision. He does not present it as an act of courage, because he does not think courage was what it required. It was more like something being resolved, a question that had been sitting unanswered in him since September 14th, that he had determined to answer if the chance came. The chance came. He stood up from his chair and he walked into the centre of the circle, and he stood there. He did not disappear. He was not taken anywhere. He did not lose consciousness. What happened was subtler than any of those things, and in some ways more disorienting, because it happened to his perception rather than to his location. He became aware, standing inside the circle beneath the light, of a doubling. Not of vision exactly, and not of sound, more fundamental than either of those. A doubling of place. He was standing in his orchard in November in central Washington state, his feet in the cold soil, the stars clear above the light that hung overhead. And simultaneously, with equal immediacy and equal clarity, he was standing in the other orchard, the abandoned one, the overgrown one. Both were real, both were present. Not one layered over the other in the way that a double exposure lays two images over each other, but both simultaneously, equally, fully there. He stood in both orchards at the same time, and he looked around. The future orchard, he has always called it that, the future orchard, though he acknowledges he has no proof it was the future, only a sense he could not shake, was not desolate in the way that abandoned places are often desolate. It was not melancholy, it was still. The trees were massive, having grown for what looked like decades without management. The grass was tall, the farmhouse was dark, its windows empty, but it was standing. The sky above it was the darker sky he had seen through the light on October 3rd, the sky that held less light, and when he looked up at it he saw something he had not expected. The sky was not empty. Across its surface, at a height that was impossible to gauge, not close, not low, but visible, there were geometric patterns. Faint, luminous, arranged in a grid that covered the entire visible sky. Not bright enough to constitute illumination, not shapes that cast any shadow on the ground below them, but present, undeniably present, like the ghost of a structure that had been suspended in the upper atmosphere and had gradually become part of the sky itself. There were figures in this orchard. He saw them at a distance. He could not specify the distance. The visual logic of this space did not correspond to the visual logic he was accustomed to. Distances seemed to compress and expand in ways that made accurate estimation impossible. They were standing among the trees. He could not tell you their number with confidence. He could not tell you their height. He could tell you that they were oriented toward him, that whatever their eyes were, if they had eyes in any conventional sense, were directed at him. And he could tell you that there was nothing in their orientation toward him that felt like threat. He has spent a long time with this assessment, and he returns to it consistently. They were not threatening. They were not welcoming in any way that implied emotional warmth. They were observational. He was the subject of a quality of attention that was patient and complete, and devoid of the kind of intent that would produce either fear or comfort. One of the figures communicated with him. He does not describe this as speech because there were no words in any sense he can identify, no sounds, no syntax, no language. What he received was something closer to a meaning delivered directly, without the vehicle of language. A single meaning, clear and complete. 4 words, more or less, though he acknowledges the reduction to language loses something in the translation. We are not arriving. We are aligning. And then he was standing in his orchard, alone. His orchard in November. The single orchard, the real orchard. The light was gone. The silence held for another few seconds, and then broke. The crickets, the distant highway, the wind through the rose, and he was alone in the dark in his own land, breathing. He sat back down in the chair and sat there for a very long time. The radiation faded completely over the following 2 weeks. The soil temperature inside the circle returned to normal. The trees within the circle, the ones whose leaves had desiccated, recovered. By the following spring, they were indistinguishable from the trees outside the circle. The fallen fruit from that first morning had been cleared away. The predictive episodes stopped. His blood returned, on the next workup, to entirely normal parameters. The altered sensory experience, the sharpened night vision, the heightened hearing, faded gradually over a period of months until they were gone. The orchard returned to what it had always been. Caleb returned to the work of running it. He did not speak publicly about what had happened for almost 2 years, and when he eventually did speak, in a carefully written account posted to a private research network, not in a television interview, not in the kind of forum that would have attracted ridicule. He did so with a specificity and a restraint that researchers who reviewed his account found notable. He made no claims beyond what he had directly experienced. He offered his photographs, his thermometer readings, his blood test records, his smartwatch data, the enhanced audio from the camera footage, and the testimony of his neighbours. He offered the framework he had constructed, the overlay hypothesis, the overlap of locations rather than the visitation of beings, not as a conclusion, but as the most internally consistent interpretation he had been able to reach. He invited correction. He received some. He incorporated what was useful and set aside what was not and went on. Each year, on the 14th of September, he is in the orchard at 11:42 in the evening. He has not missed it once, not the first year after the incident, not in the years that have followed. He brings the voice recorder, he brings the thermometer, he sits in the same chair at the edge of the same circle, which is invisible now in the healed ground, but whose exact centre he has marked with a buried stone. And each year, at 11:42, the silence comes. Not the light has not returned. Not the electromagnetic anomaly, not the falling apples or the desiccated leaves or the heat in the soil, only the silence. The total, complete, architectural silence that has nothing to do with the absence of sound. It lasts exactly 47 seconds. He counts every time. He has never miscounted. And then the crickets come back, and the frogs, and the distant highway, and the wind through the rose, and the night resumes its ordinary business. He has no explanation for this annual silence. It does not produce any measurable physical effects. It leaves no trace. It is simply there and then not there, a gap in the world's ambient noise that corresponds precisely in its duration to the 47 seconds he counted on the first night, watching the pale rectangular light above his trees. He does not know what it means. He does not know if it means anything. but he notes it carefully in the log he has kept since 2018. This man, who measures the success of a day by the concrete and tangible progress of work completed. And he sits with it the way you sit with something that is beyond your ability to resolve. And he goes back inside when it's done. In the agricultural plains of Saskatchewan, 340 miles north of the Montana border, a wheat farmer named Annette Brewer documented a circle event in the summer of 2016. In the high desert outside Burns, Oregon, a rancher named Tate Erickson reported missing time and anomalous soil readings in the spring of 2017. In the Snake River Valley in southern Idaho, multiple landowners in the same watershed reported simultaneous animal behavior anomalies and power outages on a single night in the autumn of 2019. The electromagnetic signatures, documented in each case where they were documented at all, fell within the same frequency range. The soil temperature anomalies fell within the same temperature band. The animal behavior changes followed the same pattern, and in each case, in the aftermath, the land returned to normal. The crops grew, the animals calmed, the radiation faded, and the people who had experienced what they experienced went back to their work, because the work does not pause for the inexplicable, because land requires attention regardless of what has passed above it, or through it, or alongside it. Whatever is moving through this corridor, north to south, or south to north, the directionality is not clear. Whatever is overlapping with these landscapes, these agricultural places with their specific soils and their specific electromagnetic properties and their specific relationship to water and light, it is not announcing itself. It is not leaving calling cards in any language we have learned to read. Mr. Hale implied that it had been happening for longer than any of the documented cases, that the monitoring predated the current generation of satellites and sensors, that what was being observed had been observed through older means by different agencies across a span of time that Caleb did not press him to specify. Whether that is true, and whether Mr. Hale was who he appeared to be, or something other than what he appeared to be, is not something Caleb can determine. He noted what the man said and filed it where he files things he cannot verify. We are not arriving, we are aligning. 4 words more or less. A meaning delivered without language, received by a man standing in 2 places at once, in 2 versions of the same orchard, one living and one abandoned, under 2 skies, one familiar and one mapped with geometric grids he could not name. A message that raises more questions than it answers, as all real messages do. What are they aligning? For what purpose? On what timeline? Toward what end? In the absence of answers, Caleb Mercer keeps his accounts in his paper ledger. He tends his trees. He is outside on the 14th of September every year, in the dark, in the cold, counting the seconds of a silence that belongs to something he cannot name. And whatever that something is, it keeps coming back. Not to his land, not anymore, not physically, not in any way that leaves a trace, but to the coordinates, to the place in space where his orchard and the other orchard, briefly, impossibly, occupied the same ground. The coordinates, apparently, have been noted. Something is checking them, every year, right on time.
There's a memory I've carried my entire life, crystal clear, undeniable, the kind of memory that feels more real than what happened yesterday. Everyone from my hometown has it too. We all lived through the same event. We all remember it vividly. Except when we talk about it, nothing matches. Not the small details, not the perspectives, the entire structure of what happened. And the strangest part? None of us feel uncertain. We all know exactly what we saw. We just can't agree on what that was. This is the story of the night something happened in my town. Something we all experienced. Something none of us can properly remember. And the more we tried to piece it together, the more we realised maybe we weren't supposed to. Maybe the fact that we couldn't remember it correctly was the entire point. Maybe memory itself became the experiment, and we were all unknowing participants in something far larger than a single night in a small town could ever contain. What you're about to hear isn't a simple story of strange lights or unexplained sounds. This is about the nature of consciousness itself, about the protective barriers our minds construct when faced with information that shouldn't exist, and about what happens when an entire community shares an experience that none of them can actually share accurately. This is about the moment we all realize that memory isn't a recording device, it's a translation service. And sometimes, what it translates is designed to keep us sane, rather than keep us informed. Chapter 1. A small, shared town. I grew up in a place where everyone knew everyone. The kind of town where your business was everyone's business, where gossip travelled faster than wildfire, and where shared history was the glue holding the community together. We had 2 traffic lights, 1 grocery store, and a school that served kindergarten through 12th grade under one sagging roof. The population hovered around 800 people, give or take whoever had recently been born or moved away or passed on. The kind of number where you could genuinely know every single person by name if you tried. Nothing ever happened there. That was the point. That was what people loved about it. Safety, predictability, the same faces at the same places doing the same things year after year. When something did happen, a car accident, a store closing, someone moving away, it became the story everyone told, endlessly. The narrative was communal property. Details were negotiated, agreed upon, and locked into place through repetition. The Henderson's barn fire became legendary not because of the fire itself, but because of how the telling evolved. Initially, it was just a barn fire. Within weeks, it was a cautionary tale about proper electrical maintenance. By the end of the year, it had transformed into a story about community resilience, about how everyone came together, about the meals that appeared on their doorstep for months afterward. The facts remained stable, but the meaning grew richer with each retelling until the story belonged to everyone, not just the Hendersons. That's how memory worked in our town. Collective, stable, mutually reinforced. If someone misremembered a detail, 3 other people would correct them. Stories didn't drift because they were constantly being re-anchored through conversation. Memory was social glue, and accuracy was how the glue stayed strong. That's why what I'm about to tell you is so deeply strange. Because in a town where every story gets told 1,000 times until it crystallizes into truth, we had one story that never solidified. One event that everyone experienced but no one could define. And unlike other memories that fade or blur, this one stayed sharp. It just stayed sharp in completely different directions. The town itself was unremarkable. Located in the Midwest, far enough from anything significant that we never got caught up in larger events. We weren't on the way to anywhere. We were a destination only if you lived there or were visiting someone who did. The landscape was flat farmland punctuated by small clusters of trees. The sky dominated everything, stretching in all directions without mountains or buildings to interrupt it. On clear nights, you could see every star. The absence of light pollution made the heavens feel close, almost oppressive in their vastness. I didn't realize how strange this was until much later. As a kid, I accepted it. Memory was memory. Adults talked about things differently all the time, but when I came back for a reunion years later, When we all sat around trying to remember that night, I finally understood. We weren't remembering differently. We were remembering something that couldn't be remembered correctly. And the fact that we'd all lived in a place where collective memory was sacred made the fracturing of this one memory even more impossible to ignore. The town had a rhythm. Friday night football games in the fall, church on Sundays, the 4th of July parade that was more tractors than floats. The rhythm was comforting. It created structure. It created expectation. When something disrupted that rhythm, everyone noticed. Everyone talked about it. Everyone processed it together until it fit back into the pattern. Except for that one night. That one event. It never fit back into the pattern. It existed outside the rhythm, outside the collective processing, outside the normal mechanism by which our community made sense of things. And somehow, without anyone deciding it should be this way, we all just accepted that. We moved on. We let the rhythm resume. We continued being the town where nothing happened and everyone knew everyone. But underneath that rhythm, underneath that return to normalcy, something had changed. Something fundamental. We all carried it. We all knew others carried it. We just couldn't talk about it because talking required agreement, and agreement was impossible. Chapter 2. The First Disagreement. The reunion happened at the old community centre, the same building where we'd had school dances and town meetings and holiday gatherings. 20 years had passed since graduation, and faces had changed, but voices were the same. So were the stories. We laughed about teachers, about pranks, about the small dramas that felt enormous at the time. Jennifer's failed attempt to dye her hair purple before prom. The time Michael accidentally set off the fire alarm during chemistry class. The blizzard that cancelled school for a week and left us all bored out of our minds. The stories flowed easily because they were well worn. We'd told them before. We'd agreed on them before. They were part of our shared mythology. The collective narrative of growing up together in a place where everyone knew your name and your business and your parents and your history. These stories were safe. These stories were home. Then Marcus brought it up. "Remember when they evacuated the school that one night?" he said, grinning like it was a funny memory. "When we all had to go to the gym and wait?" The table went quiet. Not uncomfortable, just attentive. Everyone remembered. You could see it in their faces, the shift in expression, the slight change in posture, recognition. But not the comfortable recognition of our other shared stories. Something else, something that made the air feel heavier. "That wasn't the school," Eleanor said slowly. "It was the church. We all met at the church." Marcus frowned. "No, definitely the school gym. I remember the bleachers. I remember sitting on those cold metal bleachers for what felt like hours." "It was October," someone else added. "Cold. We were all freezing. I remember my mum making me wear my heavy jacket and being annoyed about it." "It was summer," I said, surprising myself, but I was sure. I remembered heat, humidity, the smell of cut grass, the way my shirt stuck to my back, the feeling of wanting to be anywhere else but trapped in a building during what should have been beautiful summer evening. "You're all wrong," said Robert, who'd been our class president and always spoke with absolute certainty. It was spring, late April, early May. I remember because it was right before prom, and everyone was stressed about missing practice. We had a whole thing about whether it would affect the dance schedule. We went around the table, 9 people, 9 completely different time frames. Some remembered winter, some remembered fall. I was locked into summer, and I could feel the thick air, could remember sweat on the back of my neck, could recall the specific quality of light that comes just before sunset on a long summer day. But so could they. They felt their versions just as strongly. "Okay, but what actually happened?" Elena asked. "Why did they evacuate us?" Silence. Not the silence of forgetting. The silence of multiple people trying to access the same information and finding completely different answers. "There was a smell," someone said finally. "Like burning. But not normal burning. Something chemical. Something wrong." "No," It was a sound, Marcus said firmly. A hum. Really low. Made your teeth vibrate. I remember putting my hands over my ears, but it didn't help because it wasn't really sound. It was more like a feeling that sounded. It was lights, I said, and I remembered. Lights through the windows. Bright but not blinding. Moving but not in any recognisable pattern. Not like car headlights or spotlights or anything mechanical. Organic movement. Purposeful but not comprehensible. None of you are right, said Jennifer. It was silence. Complete silence. Like someone had hit mute on the entire world. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just this absence of sound that was louder than any noise could be. We stared at each other. Are we talking about the same thing? Elena asked. We all nodded. Absolutely. Unquestionably. Same event. Same night. Same fear. Same sense that something fundamental had shifted, but nothing else matched. Not one single detail aligned across our memories except this. Something happened. We were gathered somewhere, and afterward nothing was ever quite the same. How long did it last? Robert asked. More silence. More conflicting certainties. Hours, someone said. We were there until almost midnight. Minutes, said another. Maybe 20 minutes tops. All night, I said. We didn't leave until morning. The impossibilities were stacking up. We'd experienced the same event but retained completely incompatible versions. And unlike normal memory disagreements, where one person misremembers a detail and others correct them, we were all certain. No one felt confused or unsure. Each person's memory was vivid, detailed, complete. They just couldn't all be describing the same thing. Except they were. We knew they were. That certainty existed beneath all the contradictions. Maybe we should try to figure out what year it was, Elena suggested. That would at least narrow things down. But it didn't. Because when we started comparing the years we remembered, they spanned a 5-year period. Some people placed it in middle school, others in high school. One person was convinced it happened when we were in elementary school. The mathematics didn't work. We'd all been in the same graduating class. We'd all moved through school together. There was no 5-year window where we were all students simultaneously experiencing the same event at different ages. Yet that's what our memories insisted had happened. This is crazy, Marcus said, but he was smiling, still treating it as a curiosity rather than an impossibility. It is crazy, Elena agreed, but I know I'm right. I know what I remember. Everyone nodded, because everyone felt that way. Everyone was right. Everyone was certain, and everyone was describing something completely different. That night, after the reunion ended, and people headed back to hotels or childhood homes or wherever they were staying, I couldn't sleep. I kept running through my version of the memory. Summer evening, school building, bright lights through windows, the feeling of time stretching, adults speaking in hushed, urgent tones, being told everything was fine while knowing that nothing was fine, the lights moving in patterns that suggested intelligence but not human intelligence, and then nothing. The memory just stopped, like a film reel running out. One moment I was in that room watching those lights, and the next moment I was home in bed and it was morning and everything was normal again. But how did I get home? Who took me? What happened between watching the lights and waking up in bed? I didn't know. The information simply wasn't there, and I'd never questioned it before, never noticed the gap. The memory had felt complete until I tried to examine it closely. Now it felt like a painting with a section cut out, the frame intact, but a crucial piece missing. I pulled out my phone and texted the group we'd created. Does anyone remember leaving? Like, actually leaving? The responses came slowly, one by one, and they were all the same. No one remembered leaving. Everyone's memory ended the same way mine did. Mid-event, mid-experience, and then suddenly home, suddenly morning, suddenly over. The transition didn't exist. In a group of people with violently conflicting memories about nearly every detail, we all shared the same blank space. That should have been our first clue. but we didn't recognize it yet. We were still treating this as a curiosity, a strange quirk of collective memory. We didn't understand yet that we were starting to uncover something much larger than mismatched recollections. We were beginning to discover that memory itself had protected us from something we weren't supposed to fully remember. Chapter 3. The timeline doesn't line up. Over the next few days, we couldn't let it go. It became an obsession. We created a group chat, started comparing notes, tried to build a coherent timeline. It fell apart immediately. Those who remembered winter were certain it happened during a snowstorm. They described walking through snow to get to wherever we gathered, the cold biting their faces, the way their breath clouded in front of them. They remembered specific winter coats, boots, the sound of ice crunching underfoot. Jennifer remembered her mother scraping frost off the car windshield in the parking lot. Michael remembered slipping on ice and catching himself on a railing. These weren't vague impressions. They were specific, tactile memories with clear sensory details. Those who remembered summer were equally certain. They talked about cicadas, about wearing shorts and t-shirts, about how the air felt heavy and wrong in a way that had nothing to do with normal summer humidity. One person remembered their mother making lemonade beforehand, remembered the condensation on the glass, remembered the taste of it turning slightly warm in the heat. Another remembered fireflies in the parking lot, remembered trying to catch one before being called inside, remembered the brief glow between their cupped hands. I personally remembered it being a Friday, because I'd been looking forward to the weekend. I had plans. There was a movie I wanted to see, friends I was supposed to meet up with. The event had interrupted those plans, and I remembered feeling frustrated about it before the fear set in. But someone else remembered it being a Tuesday because they'd missed their piano lesson. They remembered their piano teacher calling their house the next day, concerned about the absence, and their mother making some excuse. Another person was sure it was a Saturday because they'd been at a birthday party earlier that day. They remembered presents, cake, playing in someone's backyard, and then later being pulled away from that normal childhood experience into something that wasn't normal at all. We tried to anchor it to external events. What grade were we in? What year was it? But even that fractured. Some people placed it in middle school, around 7th or 8th grade. Others were certain it happened in elementary school, maybe 4th or 5th grade. I would have sworn we were in 8th grade because I remembered being worried about high school starting soon. Remembered that specific anxiety that comes at the end of middle school. But Elena was absolutely certain we were in 5th grade because she remembered her 5th grade teacher, remembered the classroom, remembered specific details about that year of her life surrounding the event. The mathematics didn't work. We'd all been in school together continuously. We'd all been in the same classes at the same times. There was no year where some of us were in 5th grade and others in 8th. Yet we each carried these incompatible certainties. Robert started a spreadsheet. He listed all our names and asked everyone to provide specific details: date, season, location, duration, sensory details, what grade we were in, what we were wearing, who we saw there, what we were told. The spreadsheet quickly became a map of contradictions. Not a single column aligned across all entries. Every data point had multiple incompatible versions. Maybe it happened more than once, someone suggested. But that didn't feel right either. We all remembered it as one singular event. One night. One moment of strangeness that marked a before and after in our lives. Whatever happened, it happened once. We just couldn't agree on when, or where, or how, or what. Eleanor pointed out something interesting. Look at the duration, she said. We had estimates ranging from 15 minutes to an entire night. How can something feel like hours to one person and minutes to another? Time dilation, someone suggested. Maybe some kind of psychological effect. But that didn't explain the seasonal differences. That didn't explain why some people had physical memories of snow and others had physical memories of heat. Psychological time dilation doesn't change the weather. It doesn't rewrite which clothes were weather appropriate. It doesn't explain why Jennifer's mother was scraping frost in one version while another person's mother was serving cold lemonade in another. I started researching false memory, confabulation, the Mandela effect. I read about how memory is reconstructive rather than reproductive, how we don't replay memories like video recordings but rebuild them each time using bits of genuine experience mixed with assumptions and context. I read about how entire groups can develop false shared memories through suggestion and social reinforcement, but none of it fit. False memories are usually vague. They lack sensory detail. They feel uncertain when examined closely. Our memories weren't like that. They were sharp. They were specific. They included details that couldn't have been suggested because we hadn't discussed them before. And each person's certainty remained absolute even when confronted with contradictions. Marcus found something interesting in his parents' photo albums. His mother was an obsessive photographer, documenting everything. He found photos from what he believed was around the time of the event. Family pictures, school pictures, random snapshots of daily life. And there was a gap. A period of about a week where no photos existed. Before the gap, photos were dated in his mother's handwriting on the back. After the gap, dates resumed. But that week, nothing. No photos, no documentation. Oh, just empty pages where there should have been images. Maybe she just forgot to take pictures, someone suggested. My mother, Marcus laughed. She once took pictures of me doing homework because she thought I looked thoughtful. She didn't miss days, let alone weeks. Others checked their own family albums. Not everyone found gaps. Some people's parents weren't regular photographers. But those who did find family photos from that era found similar anomalies. Missing periods. Unexplained gaps in otherwise comprehensive documentation. Or photos that existed but were weird. Jennifer found a picture of herself that her father had taken. She was standing in the backyard, clearly reacting to something above the camera frame. Her face was tilted up, mouth slightly open, eyes wide. But not scared. That was the strange part. She looked amazed, curious, almost delighted. The kind of expression a child gets when seeing something wonderful and impossible, like a magic trick they can't figure out. "I don't remember this being taken," Jennifer said. "I don't remember that moment at all." The photo was dated. The date matched one of the windows we'd identified as a possible time for the event. But the season was wrong for Jennifer's memory. She remembered winter. The photo showed her in a light jacket, leaves on the trees in the background. Fall, maybe early spring, not winter. "Maybe the date is wrong," she said. But her father was meticulous. He always dated photos. And the surrounding photos in the album were clearly sequential. A birthday party before, a holiday gathering after, all properly dated, all making chronological sense. Except for that one image. That one impossible moment where Jennifer was looking at something the camera didn't capture, wearing clothes that didn't match her memory of the event she knew the photo was somehow connected to. We started calling these witness photos, images that seemed to document reactions to something without documenting the something itself. Several people found them. Adults and children caught mid-reaction, looking at things outside the frame, their body language suggesting awareness of something significant. But never any indication of what. The dates on these photos didn't match each other. They spanned different months, different years. If they were all documenting the same event, that event had to have been happening at multiple points in time, which was impossible, unless the event itself existed outside normal time. Unless it occupied multiple moments simultaneously, unless when people remember it happening at different times, they're all correct because it happened at all those times. But that was insane. That wasn't how reality worked. Events happened in sequence. They had a specific temporal location. You couldn't have a thing that occurred in winter and summer simultaneously. You couldn't have an experience that took place when you were 10 and when you were 13. Yet the evidence kept suggesting exactly that. And the evidence wasn't vague or uncertain. It was specific. It was documented. It was real. We were trying to solve a mystery using the assumption that reality followed rules we understood. But what if the mystery was that reality had briefly stopped following those rules? What if the reason our memories couldn't align wasn't because memory was broken, but because what we were trying to remember had been broken in a different way. Maybe we need to stop trying to figure out when it happened, Elena said during one of our marathon group chat sessions, and start trying to figure out what it means that we can't. That shifted everything, because she was right. The confusion itself was data. The contradictions were information. We'd been treating our incompatible memories as a problem to solve, as a puzzle where eventually we'd find the right pieces and everything would click into place. But what if the fact that the pieces didn't fit was the answer? What if memory had fractured for a reason? What if each person's mind had constructed a survivable version of something that wasn't survivable in its true form? We stopped trying to build a consensus timeline. We started documenting the differences instead. We created a massive document listing every single variation, every contradiction, every impossible detail. It grew to dozens of pages, and as it grew, a pattern began to emerge. Each person's memory was consistent within itself. Internally, the logic held. If someone remembered winter, all their details supported winter. Clothing, weather, indoor temperature, everything. If someone remembered summer, their entire memory was coherent to summer. No one had a memory that was internally contradictory. It was only when we compared memories that reality fell apart. It was only in the gaps between minds that impossibility emerged. That meant something. We didn't know what yet, but it meant something significant. Our minds had each constructed a coherent version of an incoherent event, and the coherence itself was suspicious, almost like it was designed, almost like something had been translated into terms we could process, almost like something had been protecting us from the truth. Chapter 4. Physical evidence that contradicts memory. Eleanor worked at the library. She had access to the town archives, boxes of old photographs that local families had donated over the years. Historical preservation was her job. She knew the collection intimately. She started digging, looking for anything from the time frame we'd discussed, or rather, time frames. She found something. In a box labelled with a range of years that covered all our conflicting dates, there were photos from what appeared to be a school event. The images were casual, the kind parents take, slightly blurry with bad lighting and imperfect composition. But the subjects were wrong. People were looking up. Dozens of faces, children and adults, all tilted towards something above the camera's view. Their expressions were identical. Not scared exactly, not even surprised. Something else. Something that looked like recognition mixed with confusion. Like seeing something familiar in an impossible context. Like watching your childhood home float 6 feet off the ground. Wrong, impossible, but undeniably what you're seeing. And the shadows were wrong. Eleanor noticed it first. She'd been trained in photographic analysis as part of her library science degree. She knew how to identify time of day based on shadow length, how to spot manipulated images, how light behaved in various conditions. These photos violated fundamental rules. The photos were taken indoors. You could see the gymnasium walls in the background, the polished wood floor, the folded bleachers against the wall. But the shadows fell at sharp angles, as if there were a light source above and to the left, positioned maybe 10 feet off the ground, casting light downward at approximately a 45-degree angle. Except gymnasiums don't have lights positioned that way. The fluorescent panels were visible in some shots, standard ceiling-mounted rectangles running in parallel lines across the ceiling. But the shadows didn't match those lights. The shadows ignored the actual light sources and responded to something else entirely. Something else was illuminating the room, something positioned where nothing should have been, and whatever it was, it cast light that behaved like light, creating shadows, illuminating faces, reflecting off surfaces, but coming from a source that didn't exist. But the strangest detail, the photos showed nothing else unusual, no mysterious objects, no strange phenomena, no obvious cause for the reactions. Just people reacting to something the camera didn't capture, or couldn't capture. We passed the photos around during our next in-person meeting. Everyone recognized them immediately. "That's it," Marcus said. That's the night. That's definitely it, Jennifer agreed. I can feel it. Like muscle memory, but for emotions. Looking at these makes me feel exactly how I felt that night. Others nodded. The recognition was visceral. But the strange thing was, people recognized photos that contradicted their memories. Marcus, who remembered winter, recognized photos where people were in light clothing. Jennifer, who remembered being at the church, recognized photos clearly taken in the school gymnasium. I, who remembered summer evening, recognized photos that appeared to have been taken at night, based on the darkness visible through the windows. We should have been more skeptical. We should have questioned whether these were really photos of the event. But we couldn't. The certainty was too strong. These images were connected to that night. We knew it the same way you know your own childhood home, even if you see it in an unfamiliar photograph from before you were born. Recognition beyond logic. Elena had done more than just find photos. She'd started cataloguing them by whose family had donated them and when they were allegedly taken. The dates written on the backs of the photos didn't match either. Some were marked with winter dates from different years, others with summer dates from different years, different handwriting, different ink colours, as if multiple people had tried to document the same event and each person marked it according to their own memory. More disturbingly, some photos had been marked and then remarked. You could see where one date had been written, then crossed out, then a different date written in the same handwriting. People had changed their minds, or changed their memories, or memories had changed on them. Look at this one, Elena said, holding up a photo carefully. It showed a group of adults standing in what appeared to be the school parking lot. Night. Cars visible in the background. All the adults were looking in the same direction, off to the left of the frame. Their postures were tense, protective. Several had their arms outstretched as if shielding children who weren't visible in the frame. "That's my mother," Marcus said, pointing to a woman near the centre of the image. "And that's your father," he added, gesturing to another figure. "And that's Principal Thompson. And is that Mayor Hendricks?" We identified nearly every adult in the photo. But none of us remembered seeing the scene. None of us remembered being in the parking lot at night. Yet there they were, our parents, our teachers, authority figures we all recognised, clearly responding to something, clearly protecting us from something, forming a human barrier between something outside the frame and something inside the frame that we'd presumably been part of. "The date on this is from winter," Elena said. "But look at the clothing. Look at what they're wearing. Light jackets, no hats, no gloves, no visible breath in the air, not winter clothing, not winter conditions." "Someone remembered it wrong when they dated the photo," Jennifer suggested. "Or the date is right and the season is wrong," Elena countered. "Or both are right, and the photo somehow shows an impossible combination. We couldn't resolve it. The evidence was there, clear, documented, real. But it contradicted itself in ways that shouldn't be possible. Robert, always the pragmatist, tried a different approach. Let's inventory what's consistent, what appears in all or most of the photos. We spread them out. Maybe 20 photos total, from different sources, allegedly from different times. We looked for commonalities. People looking up or away from the camera. That was universal. Strange shadows inconsistent with visible light sources. Present in about 75% of the images. No direct view of whatever people were reacting to. Universal. Not a single photo showed the object of everyone's attention. Time distortion markers. In several photos, clocks were visible on walls. In one gymnasium shot, the clock showed one time. In another gymnasium shot that appeared to be continuous with the first based on people's positions, the clock showed a time 3 hours later. Same people, same approximate positions, 3-hour jump. "Maybe they're not from the same night," someone suggested, but the clothing matched. The exact same people in the exact same outfits. And in a small town where everyone knew everyone, you couldn't mistake identity. That was definitely Principal Thompson. That was definitely the same yellow shirt on the same child in both photos. Same event, same sequence. Impossible time jump. We found another set of photos that showed the opposite, a sequence where people clearly moved and changed positions, where children who'd been sitting were now standing, where a woman who'd been facing one direction was now facing another. Normal progression, except all the clocks in the background showed the exact same time. 10, 15 minutes worth of activity happening in zero elapsed time according to the clocks. The clocks were broken, Marcus said. They'd stopped working. All of them, Elena asked, in multiple locations. All stopped at specific times that happened to create impossible timelines. He didn't have an answer. The photos should have been evidence. They were evidence. But evidence of what? They proved something happened. They proved people reacted. They proved our memories, however fractured and contradictory, were rooted in genuine experience. But they also proved that whatever happened existed outside normal reality, outside normal time, outside normal physics. The shadows alone, if you accepted them as genuine and not the result of photographic error, meant that light had behaved in ways light doesn't behave. Illumination from nowhere, shadows cast by sources that didn't exist. What if the cameras captured something our eyes couldn't? Jennifer suggested. What if the weird shadows are actually something visible to the camera but not to human vision? Some wavelength we can't perceive? Then we'd see it in the photos, Elena said. Cameras that capture non-visible wavelengths still display them as visible colours. Infrared shows up as red. Ultraviolet shows up as blue or purple. We'd see something. Unless it's something cameras can't fully capture either, I said. What if both human eyes and cameras are limited in the same way? What if these shadows are the artifact of something that exists outside the spectrum that either can properly perceive, the shadow of something that can't be directly photographed? It sounded insane, but the evidence was insane. We were trying to apply normal logic to fundamentally abnormal data. The photos prove something else, Robert said quietly. He'd been studying them carefully, making notes. Look at the faces. Look at the expressions. Nobody looks terrified. Some look concerned. Some look confused. Some look curious, almost excited. But nobody looks like they're witnessing something horrific. Whatever we saw, whatever this was, it wasn't experienced as a threat in the moment. He was right. Now that he pointed it out, it was obvious. The body language was all wrong for danger. People weren't cowering. They weren't fleeing. They were observing, processing, trying to understand. The adults looked protective, yes, but not panicked. The children looked amazed more than afraid, which contradicted another thing we all remembered, the fear. Every single person, when asked to describe the emotional tone of the memory, said they'd felt afraid, deeply afraid. A fear that had nothing to do with physical danger and everything to do with cosmic wrongness. A fear that came from witnessing something that shouldn't exist. But the photos showed faces that weren't afraid. So either our emotional memory was wrong, or the emotion came later, after the event, during the reconstruction, when our minds were processing what had happened and realized they needed to attach appropriate affect to an inappropriate experience. Fear wasn't what we felt. Fear was what we decided we must have felt because anything else would have been more disturbing. These photos were breaking reality in subtle ways. Each individual image could maybe be explained. Bad lighting, broken clocks, coincidental expressions. But taken together, they formed a pattern of impossibility. Evidence that something had occurred outside the normal rules by which reality operated. And we'd all been there. We'd all witnessed it. We'd all survived it. Our memories were proof of survival. The fact that we could remember anything at all, even contradictory things, even impossible things, meant we'd endured an encounter with something that should have shattered consciousness entirely. The photos weren't answers. They were confirmation that we needed to keep looking. Because whatever happened that night, it left traces, physical traces, documentation, proof. And if it left proof that cameras could capture, maybe we could find proof in other places too. Other archives, other records, other attempts to document the undocumentable. Chapter 5. The Missing Sensory Detail. As we kept comparing memories, another pattern emerged. Elena noticed it first. She'd been creating a detailed breakdown of each person's account, looking for any kind of structure in the chaos, and she found one. Each person's memory was missing something. Not vague, completely absent. A sensory channel that should have contained information but didn't. And the missing element was different for everyone. Marcus remembered seeing lights and feeling vibration through his entire body, strong enough to make his bones ache. But he couldn't recall any sound. Not muffled sound, not distant sound. Complete auditory absence, even though he remembered people shouting, remembered being told to stay calm. He knew communication happened but couldn't remember hearing it. When pressed, he described understanding what people said without auditory experience, like reading words directly from their intentions. Technically, that's impossible, he said. I know people spoke, I know what they said. I just don't remember the sound of it, which should mean I didn't understand them, but I did understand them. Perfectly. Eleanor remembered sound, a deep thrumming that seemed to come from everywhere at once, bypassing her ears and resonating directly in her chest cavity. And she remembered the smell of ozone, sharp and electric, so strong it made her eyes water. But she had no visual memory of what caused it, just darkness punctuated by that sound and smell. When she tried to picture faces, the room, anything visual, her memory went blank. Not black, not empty, just blank, like that channel wasn't receiving data. I know where I was, she said. I can tell you the shape of the space, the number of people who stood near me, but I can't see any of it. I have spatial awareness without vision, which doesn't make sense because spatial awareness comes from vision, but somehow I mapped the entire space without visual input. I remembered light, intense moving light that seemed intelligent in its movements. I remembered the way it made everyone's faces look strange, highlighted from angles that shouldn't exist, casting shadows that defied geometry. But I couldn't remember any physical sensation, not temperature, not the feeling of the ground beneath my feet, not the texture of my clothing, not even my own heartbeat, just vision, pure and disconnected from physical embodiment. It's like I was a camera, I said, just an eye recording information without a body to experience it through. Someone else, Michael, remembered only touch, the feeling of being pressed against other people, of hands grabbing his arms, of the floor vibrating beneath him in rhythmic pulses. He remembered texture and pressure and temperature variations in intricate detail, but no light, no sound, no smell, just physical sensation in a void of other input. Jennifer remembered smell primarily, not just the ozone Elena mentioned, but layers of sense that shifted and changed. Burning metal, fresh rain, something organic and alive, something ancient and mineral, a progression of smells that told a story she couldn't articulate. But her visual and auditory memories were fragmentary at best, and she had no memory of touch at all, despite knowing she'd been in a room full of people. I wasn't in my body, she said. That's what it felt like. I was just nose, just olfactory experience. Everything else was secondary or absent. As we catalogued these sensory gaps, the pattern became undeniable. Each person had experienced the event through a limited channel. But more than that, the missing sense was always the one that would have provided the most disturbing information. Marcus, who couldn't hear, would have heard something that couldn't exist. The sound would have been impossible, maybe not sound at all in the traditional sense, but vibrations in a frequency or pattern that human auditory processing couldn't categorize. His brain protected him by not storing auditory data. Eleanor, who couldn't see, would have seen something that shouldn't be possible, a visual that couldn't be reconciled with known reality. Her brain protected her by not storing visual data. I, who couldn't feel, would have felt something that would have broken my understanding of physical existence. Sensation that didn't map to a body. Experience without embodiment. My brain protected me by not storing proprioceptive data. It was as if each person's memory had filtered out the one detail that would have been impossible to reconcile. The one sense that would have contained information too alien to process. The one channel that would have transmitted truth that consciousness couldn't survive knowing. "We're not remembering through one sense," Robert said slowly. "We're remembering around one sense. Each of us has a hole where the impossible information would have been. But we all remember feeling afraid," someone pointed out. "Fear is an emotion, not a sense. So where does that live?" "Fear might be the only genuine memory we have," Elena said. "The only pure, unfiltered response. Because fear doesn't require understanding. You can be afraid without knowing why. Fear protects you by not needing explanation." That felt right. The fear was real because it didn't require the impossible information to justify itself. It was a reasonable response to unreasonable experience. It was what remained after everything else had been translated or filtered or removed. "So what does this mean?" Jennifer asked. "That we all experienced something but none of us experienced it completely? That we're each carrying a partial truth?" "Maybe not partial," I said. "Maybe complete but translated. Like our brains took in the full experience but could only store it by distributing it across different sensory channels for different people. Maybe the totality of what happened is preserved in our collective memory, but no single person has access to it all. So we'd need to combine our memories to know what actually happened," Marcus said. "But we can't combine them," Elena countered. "They're not compatible. They contradict each other on fundamental facts. We can't merge incompatible data." "Unless the incompatibility is the point," Robert said. "What if the experience was designed to be remembered incorrectly? What if the fractured, contradictory memories are the success state rather than the failure?" That stopped us, because it reframed everything. We'd been treating our memory problems as bugs. But what if they were features? What if something had tested humanity's response to the impossible, and our response, fragmenting memory in ways that preserved function while filtering impossibility, was exactly what was being measured? "That would mean it was deliberate," Jennifer said quietly. "That would mean something engineered this situation. Something made it impossible to remember correctly. Or something knows how human memory works," I said, "and structured an encounter that would necessarily be filtered this way. Not engineered to be misremembered, just structured in a way that misremembering was inevitable, because the alternative was non-function." The implications were staggering. It meant we'd all been exposed to something genuinely alien, something so far outside human sensory processing that accurate memory was impossible. And rather than breaking us, rather than destroying our ability to function, our brains had protected us by constructing survivable versions, different survivable versions, custom-tailored to each person's psychology, each brain finding its own way to process the unprocessable. "We should try combining the memories anyway," Marcus suggested. "Even if they don't fit together, maybe looking at all the pieces will show us something." We tried. We spent hours attempting to construct a unified narrative. If Marcus saw lights and felt vibration, and Elena heard sound and smelled ozone, and I saw light from different angles, and Michael felt specific physical sensations, could we build a complete picture? We couldn't. The pieces didn't just fail to fit, they actively contradicted each other. When Marcus's memory said everyone was in the gymnasium, Eleanor's said everyone was in the church. When I remembered summer evening, others remembered winter night. We couldn't even establish a consistent timeline, let alone a unified sensory experience. But we did learn something. We learned that the event had been overwhelming, full spectrum overwhelming. Every sense overloaded simultaneously with information that didn't fit normal patterns. Our brains had done triage, saving what they could, filtering what would have caused damage, distributing the preservation task differently for each person. We'd survived by not remembering correctly. And that incomplete memory, that fractured, contradictory, impossible memory, was evidence of something so alien that proper memory would have been more destructive than helpful. We were looking at collective trauma. Not trauma from danger, but trauma from encountering something so far outside our reality framework that consciousness itself had to rebuild around it. And the rebuilding process created these strange, incompatible versions, each person getting a custom memory designed to keep them functional. It's almost merciful, Jennifer said softly. Whatever did this to us, whatever showed itself to us, it knew we couldn't handle the truth. So it let us remember lies we could live with. Or our brains did that automatically, Elena said. Maybe this is just what human consciousness does when confronted with the genuinely alien. Maybe every civilization that encounters something beyond their understanding goes through this. Maybe memory itself is the protective barrier that lets intelligence survive contact with the unknowable. Both could be true, or neither. We didn't have enough information to know whether the filtering was imposed on us or generated by us. We only knew it had happened, and it had saved us. Whatever we'd seen, whatever had visited our small town on that impossible night, had been too much, too alien, too outside the boundaries of normal human experience, and we'd survived by forgetting it accurately. That wasn't failure. That was the most sophisticated defense mechanism consciousness possessed. And it had worked perfectly. Chapter 7. The Local Records. Robert worked for the county and had access to old municipal records. After our breakthrough about the sensory filtering, he became obsessed with finding official documentation, something that would ground the event in bureaucratic reality. If it happened, there would be records. Government loved records. Schools loved records. Something had to exist beyond our fractured memories and ambiguous photos. What he found was unsettling in its vagueness. There were references, multiple references across different departments and time frames, but never descriptions, just acknowledgement that something had occurred and needed to be addressed. School board meeting minutes from one of the disputed years contained a single line. Agenda Item 7, addressing parent concerns following the incident. Motion to continue current protocols. Passed unanimously. No details about what incident. No specification of what protocols. Just that calm, bureaucratic acknowledgement that something had happened and decisions had been made. The local newspaper had a small article buried in the community section. The headline read, "Town Gathers During Disruption." The article was 3 sentences long. It mentioned that residents had gathered at an undisclosed location due to an undisclosed situation that had been resolved by local authorities. That was all. No quotes from officials, no description of the disruption, no follow-up articles, just that brief, almost deliberately uninformative notice. "This is bizarre," Robert said. "Newspapers thrive on detail, even small-town newspapers. They'd normally interview people, get quotes from the mayor, explain what happened. This reads like they were actively avoiding information." Police logs showed increased calls during several of the timeframes we'd identified, but the nature of the calls was marked as resolved on scene, with no further documentation. Dozens of calls over several hours on different dates that matched different people's memories, all marked the same way, all terminated without explanation. "Resolved how?" Marcus asked when Robert showed us the logs. "Resolved by doing what? These are official records. They're supposed to document police activity." "Unless documenting it accurately was impossible," Elena suggested. "What do you write in a police report when the situation doesn't fit any existing category? When what you responded to can't be described in bureaucratic language?" Medical records from the local clinic showed a spike in anxiety-related visits following the various dates we'd identified. People reporting nightmares, stress, difficulty concentrating, a general sense that something was wrong without being able to specify what. But no one described what had triggered these symptoms. The medical notes just indicated following recent event without clarification. The clinic records were particularly interesting because they included a note from the primary physician at the time, now retired, expressing concern about the number of patients presenting with similar symptoms, but unable to articulate causation, recommending community support resources for stress management following undisclosed collective experience. Undisclosed collective experience. That phrase appeared multiple times in different documents. Always undisclosed. Always collective. Always experience rather than incident or event, as if the documentation couldn't quite commit to claiming something external had happened. School attendance records showed an anomaly that made no sense. For a period of 3 days across multiple potential dates in multiple years, Attendance was marked, but no daily activities were recorded. Classes happened, students were present, teachers were present, but there were no lesson plans filed, no assignments noted, no record of what actually occurred during those school days, just attendance marks indicating everyone was there. "How is that possible?" Jennifer asked. "Teachers have to file lesson plans. It's required. The school board audits them. You can't just have empty days in the official record." "Unless filing accurate lesson plans would have required describing what actually happened during those days," Robert said, "and that was impossible. So they filed attendance, proof people were at school, but nothing about what occurred while they were there. We found similar gaps in other institutional records. Church bulletins from around the various dates showed cancelled services or services with no notes about topic or attendance. The town council minutes showed meetings that occurred, but had no agenda items listed. The library circulation records showed dates where the building was open, according to the logs, but no books were checked out or returned. It was as if the entire town's institutional infrastructure had experienced the same filtering our individual memories had. Official records existed, proving time had passed and activities had occurred, but the content of those activities was mysteriously absent. "This isn't cover-up," Elena said, studying the document spread across her dining room table. "This is accommodation. The town didn't hide what happened. The town couldn't record what happened, so it recorded that something happened while leaving the something undefined." "But why?" Marcus asked. "Why wouldn't someone, a reporter, a teacher, a town official, just write down what they saw?" "Because they couldn't," I said, finally understanding. Not wouldn't, couldn't. The same mechanism that filtered our personal memories filtered the official record. When people tried to document it, they found themselves unable to articulate it. Not blocked by others, blocked by their own inability to translate the experience into documentary language. Robert found one more document that confirmed this. A memo from the school superintendent to staff, dated approximately 1 week after one of the possible event dates. The memo was remarkable for what it attempted to say without saying anything. "Dear staff, regarding the recent situation about which we cannot provide full detail, please note that all standard protocols remain in effect. Students should be monitored for signs of stress, but excessive discussion of the matter is discouraged, as it appears to exacerbate anxiety rather than relieve it. Parents have been notified that the situation was handled appropriately and no further action is required. If you find yourself struggling to document recent activities in your records, please use general terminology and focus on student well-being rather than specific incident details. Thank you for your professionalism during this unusual time." The memo said everything by saying nothing. It acknowledged that something had happened. It acknowledged that documenting it was difficult. It acknowledged that discussing it was problematic. And it provided guidance for navigating an undefinable situation through bureaucratic vagueness. "Excessive discussion exacerbates anxiety," Elena read aloud. "That's interesting. That suggests they tried talking about it and found that talking made it worse." "Makes sense," Robert said. "If everyone's memory is different, trying to establish consensus would just create conflict and confusion. Better to acknowledge something happened and move on without forcing alignment." The official records told the same story our personal investigation had uncovered. Something impossible had occurred. The town had experienced it collectively, and the town had collectively failed to create a unified narrative because a unified narrative was impossible. The experience exceeded the capacity of both individual and institutional memory to process it accurately. What made it haunting was the calm acceptance in these documents. No panic, no demands for investigation, no calls for explanation, just quiet acknowledgement and peaceful continuation, as if the town had organically understood that some experiences exist beyond documentation, beyond consensus, beyond explanation. The records weren't evidence of forgetting. They were evidence of a community choosing to function despite not fully understanding what they'd functioned through. They were proof that humans can continue, can maintain social structures and institutions and normalcy, even after encountering something that should have shattered all of that. We'd survived not just individually but collectively, and the collective survival looked like bureaucratic vagueness, institutional gaps, and official documents that said as little as possible while confirming that something requiring documentation had definitely occurred. It was the most human response possible to the inhuman. We wrote it down without writing it down. We remembered by not quite remembering. We moved forward while carrying an impossible shared past, and life went on. School continued, church continued, town council met, library circulated books. The mechanisms of community kept functioning because humans are remarkably good at functioning, despite confusion, despite contradiction, despite cosmic uncertainty. The records proved we'd survived, and survival looked like incomplete documentation, vague references, and the quiet agreement that some things don't need to be fully explained to be acknowledged as real. Chapter 8. The Unspoken Agreement. The more we investigated, the clearer it became that the town had made a choice. Not a conscious one, not a coordinated one, but a choice nonetheless. After the event, whatever it was, people had simply moved on. There were no town meetings to discuss it, no parent groups demanding answers, no investigative committees or official inquiries. Life continued. People went to work, kids went to school. The rhythm of small-town existence resumed without interruption. We found this staggering. In a town where a broken stoplight would generate 3 weeks of heated debate at the coffee shop, where the decision to change the school mascot had caused a near schism in the community, where everyone had opinions about everyone else's business, how had something this significant been absorbed without discussion? Then Elena found something in her mother's journal. Elena's mother had been a meticulous diary keeper, documenting daily life in careful detail since before Elena was born. The journals filled an entire bookshelf in her parents' home. Decades of handwritten observations, thoughts, records of mundane and significant moments alike. Her mother recorded what she ate, what she wore, what the weather was like, what Elena did, what happened at work, what was discussed at church. Everything. The entries around the event were bizarre. The day before, normal entry, weather, meals, Elena's homework progress, a neighbour's new car, plans for the weekend, several paragraphs of detailed observation in her mother's neat handwriting. The day after, normal entry, weather, meals, Eleanor's mood, grocery shopping, a phone call with a friend. Again, detailed and comprehensive. The day of the event, blank, not missing. The page was there. The date was written at the top in the same careful hand, but the rest of the page was empty except for one line in the middle. We were all together. Everything is fine now. Eleanor called her mother and asked about it. "Oh, that was a strange time," her mother said vaguely. "I remember feeling like I should write something, but I couldn't quite. I tried to write about what happened, but every time I started, the words didn't feel right. They felt dishonest somehow. Not because they were lies, but because they were incomplete. Like writing anything specific would be worse than writing nothing at all." "But what did happen?" Eleanor pressed. Her mother paused for a long time. "Honey, I don't know how to answer that. I remember being there. I remember you being there. I remember other people. I remember feeling like something very important was occurring. But when I try to be more specific, it's like trying to describe a dream after you've woken up. You know you dreamed something significant, but the details won't stay in your mind long enough to communicate them." "But you wrote that everything was fine," Elena said. "Why did you write that specifically?" "Because it was true," her mother said simply. "Whatever happened, and something definitely happened, it ended with everyone safe. That felt important to record. The safety, the togetherness, those were the only true things I could put into words." That phrase, "we were all together, everything is fine now," appeared in multiple places once we started looking. Marcus found it in a letter his father had written to a relative. Jennifer found it in an old church bulletin as a closing blessing. Michael found it carved into a bench at the park, undated but in a style consistent with that time period. I found it in my own mother's handwriting on a calendar square for one of the disputed dates. The exact same phrase, Different handwriting, different contexts, different sources, but the exact same words, as if that was the only thing that could be said because saying anything else would require saying too much. It's like a mantra, Robert said, or a spell, something you repeat to ward off the need for further explanation. We started asking around more carefully, talking to people who'd been adults during that time, trying to gauge what the community-wide response had been. We were careful not to lead them, not to suggest anything. We just asked generally about that period, about whether they remembered anything unusual. Most people deflected. "Oh, that was a long time ago," or "My memory of those years is pretty fuzzy," or "Why are you asking about that?" The last question, delivered with a tone that suggested they knew exactly why we were asking, but preferred we didn't push. A few people were more forthcoming, but in strange ways. The former police chief, now well into his 80s, said, "Some things happen that don't fit into reports. That's just how it is. You learn in this job that reality is bigger than the paperwork. Good officers know when to document and when to just manage. We managed. Everyone was safe. That's what mattered." The retired school principal, whom we found living in a nursing home one town over, said, "You kids are stirring up something that settled a long time ago. That's your right, I suppose. You were there. You have questions. But let me tell you something. Not everything that happens needs to be explained. Sometimes the explanation would cause more harm than the mystery. We decided, well, not decided. It wasn't that organized. But we collectively understood that moving forward was healthier than looking back. And we were right. Look at you. You all grew up fine, successful, well-adjusted. That happened because we didn't dwell." "But what were we not supposed to dwell on?" Jennifer asked. The principal smiled sadly. "If I could answer that question clearly, honey, we would have dwelled on it. The fact that I can't answer it, the fact that nobody can, that's exactly why we didn't." The former mayor was the most direct. We found him at the hardware store he'd owned for 40 years. When we asked about the event, he actually laughed. "You know what's funny?" he said. "Every few years, someone from your generation asks about that night, and every time I try to explain it, and every time I fail. Not because I'm hiding anything, because there's nothing to hide. We all remember it happened. We all remember being there. We all remember it being important. But the specifics? They're smoke. You can see smoke. You know it's real. But if you try to grab it, you come away with nothing." "So the town just agreed not to talk about it?" Marcus asked. "No," the mayor said firmly. "The town tried to talk about it. In the days after, people tried. But every conversation went in circles. People would start describing what happened and quickly realize they were describing different things. And instead of creating understanding, the discussions created confusion and anxiety. People got upset. Relationships got strained. So gradually, organically, we stopped trying. We acknowledged that something happened. We confirmed everyone was safe. And we moved on." "That seems wrong," I said. "That seems like giving up on truth." "Maybe," the mayor said. "Or maybe it's recognizing that truth comes in different forms. The truth is something happened. The truth is we survived it. The truth is we remained a community afterward. Those truths are accessible. The truth about what exactly happened. That truth might not be accessible to human minds, and chasing an inaccessible truth at the cost of accessible ones, that's not wisdom. That's stubbornness." It started to make sense. The town hadn't covered anything up. The town had accommodated something impossible by creating a shared framework of acceptable non-discussion. Not silence, not secrecy, just mutual recognition that certain experiences exist beyond language, beyond consensus reality, and trying to force them into words would damage the careful translations our minds had constructed to protect us. It was a survival mechanism at the community level, matching the survival mechanisms at the individual level. Just as each person's brain had filtered the experience to prevent psychological damage, the community had filtered discussion of the experience to prevent social damage. Both were acts of protection. Both were forms of intelligence responding to a threat that was more subtle than physical danger. The threat was cognitive. The threat was the possibility that forcing consensus on an event that couldn't support consensus would fracture the community as surely as the event itself could have fractured individual minds. So the community adapted. It found a way to acknowledge without defining, to remember without agreeing, to carry forward without resolution. And it had worked. The town remained functional. Relationships remained intact. Institutions continued serving their purposes. Life went on with grace and normalcy despite, or perhaps because of, the shared acceptance of an inexplicable past. Maybe that's what makes us human, Eleanor said during one of our late-night discussions. The ability to function despite confusion. The ability to move forward carrying questions we can't answer. Most animals need certainty to survive. They need to understand threat, understand safety, understand cause and effect. But humans, we can tolerate cosmic uncertainty. We can shrug at the inexplicable and make lunch anyway. Or maybe that's what makes this town special, Jennifer countered. Maybe most communities would have torn themselves apart trying to force consensus. Maybe we got lucky. Maybe the specific combination of people and personalities and local culture allowed for this graceful accommodation. Or maybe this happens everywhere, I said. Maybe encounters with the inexplicable are more common than we think, and communities all over the world have these shared experiences that never get properly discussed or defined. Maybe humanity is constantly brushing against something beyond understanding, and we survive it through exactly this mechanism. Vague acknowledgement and social agreement not to push for clarity. We couldn't know. But the pattern was clear. Our town had faced something impossible and had survived by not forcing it to be possible, by not demanding it make sense, by not requiring everyone's experience to align. The unspoken agreement wasn't weakness. It was sophisticated collective intelligence. It was the social equivalent of our individual memory filtering, a protective mechanism that preserved function by distributing the burden of the impossible across the entire community in a way that no individual had to carry too much weight. We were all together. Everything is fine now. Those words weren't denial. They were acknowledgement of the only things that could be safely acknowledged. Togetherness, the shared experience, fineness, the survival. Everything else was unnecessary detail that would cause more problems than solutions. The town had been wise, and we, digging into it 20 years later, were beginning to understand that wisdom. We could excavate the mystery. We could document the contradictions. We could prove something happened. But maybe we couldn't, and shouldn't, try to force it into coherence. Maybe the healthy response was the one the town had already found. Acknowledge, accept, move forward. Some truths were meant to remain undefined, not because they weren't real, but because their reality exceeded the framework by which definition occurred. Chapter 9. The Realization. Late one night, alone in my hotel room, the full understanding hit me. I'd been lying awake for hours, thinking through everything we'd discovered, and suddenly all the pieces aligned. The event wasn't forgotten. It couldn't be forgotten. It was too significant, too impactful, too deeply carved into the collective memory of everyone who experienced it. But it also couldn't be remembered accurately, because human neurology wasn't equipped to process what actually happened. So our brains did something remarkable. They created individualized translations, custom-built memories that preserved the emotional truth, the significance, the impact, while replacing the incomprehensible details with comprehensible substitutes. Each person got the version they could survive, the version that wouldn't break their understanding of reality. We hadn't been manipulated. We hadn't been programmed or altered by some external force. This was our own neurology doing what it evolved to do, protect consciousness from information that would damage it. Our brains looked at something impossible and said, I can't store this as is, but I can store something equivalent. And they did. The conflicting timelines made perfect sense. If the event existed outside normal causality, existing in multiple moments simultaneously or in no moment specifically, Each brain would anchor it to whenever made the most psychological sense for that individual. Someone stressed about upcoming exams might anchor it to the period right before prom. Someone who associated major events with winter might place it in cold weather. Someone whose strongest memories were of summer freedom might place it there. The brain used personal chronological landmarks to file something that had no proper chronological location. The conflicting locations made perfect sense. If the actual location was incomprehensible, or existed in some state that couldn't be mapped to normal geography, each brain would substitute the location that best represented gathering safety or authority in their personal symbolic lexicon. For some, that was the school. For others, the church. For others, somewhere else entirely. The brain used physical metaphors for something that might not have had a proper physical location. The missing senses made perfect sense. Each person's memory excluded the sensory input that would have been most damaging, the input that couldn't be translated into safe terms. Vision, hearing, smell, touch, taste. Whatever sense would have conveyed the most disturbing truth simply wasn't stored, not erased, not blocked, just never encoded in the first place, because encoding it would have required processing information that would damage the processor. And the physical evidence aligned with this. The photographs captured genuine reactions to something that cameras couldn't record. The shadows were wrong because the light source wasn't something that created normal photonic shadows. It was something else masquerading as light, or interacting with light in ways that created artifacts the camera could capture but couldn't properly represent. The official records were vague because the people writing them were translating an experience even as they documented it, unable to access the true memory, while simultaneously knowing something significant had occurred. We'd encountered something, all of us, something that existed beyond human perception, something so far outside our evolutionary framework for understanding reality that direct experience would have been destructive, and rather than destroying us, rather than driving us mad with impossible information, our brains had saved us. They'd created survivable versions of an unsurvivable experience. The encounter succeeded precisely because we couldn't remember it correctly. I got out of bed and opened my laptop, started typing everything I was thinking. The pieces were fitting together in a way that felt simultaneously terrifying and revelatory. What if this was common? What if contact with non-human intelligence happened regularly, but was necessarily filtered through exactly this mechanism? What if every UFO report, every encounter story, every abduction narrative was a translation of genuine contact that the experiencer's brain had processed into the most comprehensible form available? That would explain the contradictions in those reports, the varying details, the way people described similar experiences in wildly different terms, not because they were lying or confused, but because their brains were each solving the same problem: how to remember the unrememberable, using different solutions. It would explain why physical evidence was always ambiguous, not because the events weren't real, but because the events existed in a way that physical evidence couldn't properly capture. Cameras could photograph reactions, they could capture artifacts, strange shadows, unusual light, distorted backgrounds, but they couldn't capture the thing itself because the thing itself existed outside the spectrum of reality that cameras were designed to document. It would explain why governments couldn't provide clear answers even when they wanted to, not because of conspiracy, but because the institutional knowledge was as filtered and contradictory as individual memory. Officials who investigated these events encountered the same translation problem. They found evidence, they found witnesses, but they couldn't construct a unified narrative because unified narratives were impossible when the underlying reality exceeded the framework by which narratives were constructed. The whole phenomenon, global, across cultures, across centuries, might be humanity repeatedly encountering something beyond our perceptual capacity and repeatedly translating it into manageable forms. The forms varied because different cultures provided different translation frameworks, but the underlying experience might be identical. The aliens, the angels, the fairies, the gods, all different cultural translations of the same incomprehensible contact, and the encounters continued because they were successful. Because whatever was making contact, if something was deliberately making contact, had learned that humans could survive it, that we had built-in protective mechanisms, that we could experience the impossible and continue functioning afterward. We were being tested, not for our technology or our intelligence or our worthiness, for our cognitive resilience, for our ability to encounter the alien and maintain coherent consciousness despite not being able to accurately comprehend what we'd encountered and we'd passed. Not just my town, every person who'd ever reported an unexplainable experience and then continued living their life had passed. The test wasn't whether we could understand. The test was whether we could fail to understand without failing to function. I felt a strange peace settling over me. For weeks we'd been treating our fractured memories as a problem, as something broken that needed fixing. But they weren't broken. They were working exactly as designed. And the design was brilliant. Human consciousness had evolved a fail-safe mechanism. When reality exceeded processing capacity, memory translated rather than recorded. It preserved function at the cost of accuracy. And that trade-off, that sacrificing of perfect knowledge for continued ability to operate, was sophisticated intelligence at work. We weren't blind or limited or damaged. We were protected. And the protection was so elegant, so seamless, that we didn't even notice it happening. We just woke up the next day with memories that made sense, even if they didn't make sense when compared to others' memories, and we moved on, and we survived. Whatever had visited our town that night had learned something about humanity, had observed our response to the impossible, and our response had been to translate it into the possible, even if that meant creating dozens of different possible versions that contradicted each other. That was remarkable. That was worth observing. That might even be what made humanity interesting to something far more advanced. Not our technology, which was primitive compared to beings that could manipulate reality itself. Not our culture, which was young compared to civilizations that might span millennia. But our cognitive adaptability, our ability to encounter the truly other and create functional understanding even when true understanding was impossible. I emailed the group my thoughts. The responses came slowly over the next hours as people woke up and checked their phones. Elena, this feels right. This feels like the answer we've been looking for. Not what happened, but why we can't agree on what happened. Marcus, so we're not crazy. We're protected. I can live with that. Jennifer, but do you think they knew? The aliens or whatever they were? Do you think they knew we'd remember it wrong? Robert, maybe they were counting on it. Maybe that's the whole point of first contact. Not to be remembered accurately, but to test whether we can survive not remembering accurately. And finally from Michael, does this mean it could happen again? If they learned we could handle it, could they come back? That was the question that kept me awake for the rest of the night. If our response had been observed and deemed successful, would the observers return? Would they test again? Or had they learned everything they needed to learn from that one encounter? Or maybe, and this thought was even more unsettling, maybe they'd never left. Maybe they were constantly present, constantly observing, and we simply couldn't perceive them except during moments when they deliberately made themselves available to human consciousness. And those moments were necessarily translated into comprehensible but inaccurate forms. Maybe we were always swimming in an ocean of reality we couldn't perceive, and occasionally something from that ocean touched us, and we felt it as something alien and impossible. And our brains did what they'd evolved to do. They protected us by translating the experience into something survivable. And that protection was why humanity continued. Why we could encounter the unknown repeatedly throughout history and not be destroyed by it. Why we could brush against cosmic truth and wake up the next day still functional, still ourselves, still capable of making lunch and going to work and loving our families. We were resilient in a way we didn't fully appreciate, and that resilience might be the most human thing about us. Chapter 10. Why it never happened again. The last piece of the puzzle was why. Why had this happened? Why to us? Why only once? We had no direct evidence, of course, no communication from the visitors, no message explaining their purpose, no follow-up contact, just that one night, or multiple versions of one night, and then nothing. 2 decades of silence, 2 decades of normal life interrupted only by the questions we couldn't stop asking. But patterns emerged as we talked, as we compared notes not just on what we remembered, but on what happened afterward, on what changed, on what stayed the same. The event had observed something, measured something, tested something. Not our physical responses. There was no medical experiment, no physical examination, nothing invasive or harmful. Not our technology or our civilization. A small town in the Midwest had nothing unique to offer in that regard. Something deeper. It had tested how we reconstructed reality, how consciousness handled the impossible, how memory created continuity when direct experience couldn't. It had observed the mechanism by which intelligent beings protected themselves from information that exceeded their processing capacity. And it only needed to happen once because the data was complete. Every person produced a different translation. Every brain solved the problem of impossible memory in a unique way. The variations themselves were the result. The diversity of responses, the contradictory memories, the personalized filtering, that was the answer to whatever question was being asked. The experiment wasn't about what we saw or experienced. It was about how we remembered seeing and experiencing it. It was about the layer between raw input and stored memory, about the translation engine that made consciousness possible in a universe full of things consciousness couldn't directly process. That's why there were no follow-ups, no repeat events, no ongoing encounters. The phenomenon, whatever it was, had learned what it needed to learn. We demonstrated that human consciousness had a built-in protection mechanism against reality that exceeded our architecture. We'd shown that when confronted with the truly alien, the truly other, we didn't break, we translated. And translation, while imperfect, allowed function, allowed survival, allowed continuation. That might have been the valuable insight. That intelligence didn't require perfect perception. That consciousness could thrive even when surrounded by truth it couldn't directly access. That the filter itself, the mechanism that incorrectly stored impossible information as possible information, was a feature of intelligence rather than a bug. Marcus put it perfectly during one of our last conversations before everyone headed back to their regular lives. Maybe first contact already happened. Maybe it happens all the time. We just can't know it happened because knowing it correctly would destroy the knowing part of us. The thought was simultaneously terrifying and comforting. Terrifying because it meant we might be constantly surrounded by realities we couldn't perceive, constantly interacting with forces we couldn't recognize, constantly being observed or tested or contacted in ways that left no trace we could consciously access. Comforting because it meant we were protected. Our consciousness had shields we didn't know we needed until something tested them, and those shields worked. We survived. We continued. We built lives and memories and meaning on top of an experience that shouldn't have been survivable. That wasn't failure of perception. That was triumph of consciousness. Whatever observed us that night got its answer. Humans can encounter the impossible and create possible versions. We can experience what we can't understand and still maintain coherent identity. We're protected by the very limitations that seem to constrain us. Our inability to perceive ultimate reality wasn't weakness. It was the sophisticated defense mechanism that allowed us to exist in a universe full of things that would otherwise overwhelm consciousness. The event never repeated because it succeeded perfectly the first time. One data point was sufficient. One small town full of people whose brains each solved the translation problem differently demonstrated the principle clearly. Further testing would have been redundant. Or maybe it repeated constantly, and we just didn't notice. Maybe our whole lives were full of encounters we translated into mundane experience. Maybe the truly alien wasn't rare. Maybe our perception of the alien as rare was itself a translation, a way of making constant contact with the impossible feel manageable by categorizing it as exceptional. We'd never know. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps being unable to know was exactly what made us worth contacting in the first place. I thought about what my town looked like from outside. A dot on a map. 800 people living unremarkable lives. Nothing special. Nothing that would attract attention. But maybe that was precisely why it was chosen. Because the response they were testing wasn't dependent on sophistication or advancement. It was fundamental to human consciousness. And a small town demonstrated it as clearly as a city or a nation, or the species as a whole would have. We were a sample, a data point, a test subject, and we'd performed beautifully without knowing we were performing at all. The visitors, if that's what they were, had probably moved on, probably testing other species, other forms of consciousness, building a map of how intelligence handled reality that exceeded its processing architecture. Our results were filed somewhere, in some form we couldn't imagine, serving some purpose we'd never understand, and that was fine. We didn't need to understand it. We just needed to have survived it, and we had. Epilogue. The encounter. We survived. I'm back home now, back in the city, far from that small town where I grew up. But I think about it constantly, about that night, about what we learned, about what we'll never know. Sometimes I wonder if they're disappointed in us, whatever they were, if they looked at humanity and saw a species trapped in neurological translation, forever separated from true reality by layers of protective interpretation, if they found us limited, insufficient, blind. But I don't think that's it. I think they found exactly what they were looking for, evidence that consciousness can persist in the face of the truly alien, that intelligence can function even when true understanding is impossible, that we're adapted not just to our environment, but to the possibility of encountering things beyond our environment. Maybe that's what makes consciousness valuable in the universe. Not our ability to perceive truth, but our ability to survive falsehood when truth would be fatal. Not our capacity for perfect knowledge, but our capacity to function with imperfect knowledge. Not our understanding of reality, but our ability to operate despite not understanding reality. Maybe every intelligent species has this mechanism. Maybe it's the prerequisite for intelligence itself, the capacity to create workable fictions when reality becomes unworkable. Maybe consciousness arose precisely because it could filter and translate, because perfect perception of everything would paralyze rather than enable action. Or maybe we're unique. Maybe we're the species that can be shown the impossible and construct elaborate, individualized, protective lies about what we saw, and then live peacefully with those lies forever. Maybe that's our evolutionary gift. Maybe that's what makes humanity special in a cosmos full of intelligence. Not our wisdom or our technology or our culture, but our ability to be fundamentally wrong about something and still thrive. I'll never know what really happened that night. None of us will. Our brains made sure of that when they translated an impossible experience into dozens of possible ones. But I know something did happen. Something real. Something significant. Something that found us worthy of observation precisely because observation was impossible. The group chat is still active. We still compare notes sometimes, though less frequently now. The memories haven't converged. They never will. We've stopped trying to find consensus because we understand now that consensus was never the point. The variation was the point. The protection was the point. The survival was the point. Eleanor summed it up best last week when someone new joined the chat. Another person from town who'd heard about our investigation and wanted to share their memories. Maybe the most human thing we can do is remember together while remembering differently. Maybe that's what they wanted to see, that we can share an experience without sharing a memory, that we can have collective truth without identical truth. I think she's right. I think that's exactly what was tested, and I think we passed. We didn't forget what happened. We couldn't forget what happened. It was too significant, too impactful. too deeply carved into our consciousness to fade away like normal memories do. But we also couldn't remember what happened. We couldn't access the truth of it, couldn't reconstruct the event as it actually occurred. So we did something more remarkable. We remembered what we were able to, and that was enough. That was sufficient. That was proof of something valuable. We encountered the alien. We survived the impossible. We protected each other through the act of remembering differently, because if we'd all remembered the same thing, that thing would have been something we couldn't live with. The diversity of our memories was the mechanism by which collective sanity was preserved. The encounter worked because we failed to accurately remember it. And in that failure, we demonstrated something success never could have shown. That consciousness isn't about perceiving reality. It's about surviving it. It's about taking in more information than you can process and finding a way to store it that allows you to wake up the next day still functional, still yourself, still capable of love and work and meaning. Whatever observed us that night learned that about humanity, and then they left us alone. Not because we failed, because we succeeded brilliantly at the one test that mattered. We proved we could encounter the other and remain ourselves. Even if remaining ourselves meant never knowing what the other really was, even if remaining ourselves meant accepting that reality was bigger than our ability to comprehend it, even if remaining ourselves meant living with questions we'd never answer and contradictions we'd never resolve, that's not a limitation. That's a superpower. And somewhere, in some way we'll never perceive, in some dimension or reality or consciousness we can't access. I think they know that now, because we showed them. One impossible night in a small town where everyone remembers what happened, just not the same way. And that difference saved us all, because if we'd all remembered the same impossible thing, that impossible thing would have broken us all the same way. But we each remembered a different possible thing, custom-tailored to our individual psychology, perfectly calibrated to allow survival. That's elegant, that's sophisticated. That's the kind of solution to an impossible problem that suggests consciousness itself is more remarkable than we give it credit for. We're not broken recorders, we're brilliant translators. We take reality as it comes, filter what would destroy us, and create functional understanding, even when perfect understanding is impossible, and we do it automatically, without training, without conscious effort. Our brains just do it. They protect us. They preserve us. They let us continue. The event in my hometown wasn't unique. I understand that now. It happens everywhere in different forms to different people. Every unexplained experience, every moment of impossible beauty or cosmic horror, every encounter with something beyond normal reality, they're all translated, filtered, rendered survivable. We live in a universe full of things we can't directly perceive, and we survive because we don't need to perceive them directly. We just need to perceive them sufficiently, and sufficient perception looks like translation, like interpretation, like customized versions of truth that preserve the important parts, the emotional truth, the experiential truth, the consequential truth, while replacing the incomprehensible parts with comprehensible metaphors. That's what memory is. That's what consciousness is. That's what being human is. We're not witnesses to reality. We're translators of reality. And the translation, while imperfect, is what allows us to exist in a cosmos that would otherwise be too much for beings of our particular architecture to handle. So I'm grateful for the event, even though I don't know what it really was. Grateful for my fractured memory, because it means I survived something that would have destroyed accurate memory. Grateful for the contradiction, because it means my brain cared more about my function than about my perfect recollection. And I'm grateful for my town, for the way we collectively handled something that could have torn us apart, for the wisdom of moving forward without forcing consensus, for the grace of acknowledging shared experience without demanding shared details. We were all together. Everything is fine now. Those words still resonate. They're still true. They're more true than any detailed description could ever be, because they capture what matters, the survival, the togetherness, the fineness of our continued existence despite cosmic disruption. Whatever happened that night, we survived it together. And survival together while remembering separately is perhaps the most profound form of connection consciousness can achieve. That's the story. That's the truth we can access. And it's enough. Maybe even more than enough. Maybe it's everything.